I died because I was trying to save face in front of people who would not have remembered my name by next semester. That is the version I have settled on anyway. The official version probably involved a wet crosswalk, a delivery scooter, and the kind of unlucky angle nobody survives cleanly. My version feels more accurate. I was standing outside my university building with one ear full of my best friend laughing, one eye on the guy everyone liked, and one stupid half-step away from admitting I had wasted 2 years orbiting a romance that was never going to look back at me. Then horn went off, somebody shouted, and the whole world cut hard to white. When I opened my eyes again, I was not in a hospital. I was lying on polished floorboards under a bed that looked expensive enough to charge tuition. My cheek hurt. My collar was too tight. There was a red ribbon tangled around my wrist and a voice above me saying, very clearly, if you're going to hide under furniture, at least do it before my mother arrives. I rolled out from under the bed and hit the edge of a carved nightstand with my shoulder. A boy in a dark school uniform was staring down at me, like I had personally lowered the value of his bloodline. Black hair, gray-blue eyes, perfect posture, annoyed expression sharpened into something almost elegant. I knew that face, not because I knew him, because my roommate had spent the last month reading a webtoon on speaker while pretending she was just checking comments. I had seen those eyes in 37 different fan edits set to dramatic piano. That was the male lead, and I was not. I knew that before I even found a mirror. You do not get dropped into a story and immediately wake up next to the center of gravity unless you are there to be used. Friend, rival, comedic obstacle, disposable witness. The room was too neat, the air too sweet with laundry soap and cedar polish, and the boy in front of me too visibly exhausted by my existence for me to be anything important. Then he said the name that finished the job. Julian, if you make me late again, I will tell head prefect Leora you forged my attendance stamp. Julian, right. Not Adrian Voss, the cold genius male lead with 5 hidden traumas and better hair than morally necessary. Not Yuna Bell, the female lead with the scholarship secret, the impossible kindness, and the emotional range of a person who actually deserves to be loved by readers. Julian Mercer, the second lead's best friend, tall, bright, harmless, useful, the guy who laughed on cue, got pushed into side routes, and eventually lost with dignity so that the central pair could shine harder by comparison. My roommate liked him because he understood timing. I had barely remembered his surname. That should have panicked me more than it did. Instead, I had one stupid, perfectly clear thought. At least I wasn't the guy destined to lose beautifully. I looked up at Adrian, took in the open wardrobe, the silver tie pin on the desk, the stack of academy books, the sunlight cutting through lace curtains, and said the only sentence my brain could afford. What year is it? He stared at me for a second longer. That is your opening move. Is it the wrong one? He pinched the bridge of his nose, which was unfairly attractive behavior for somebody clearly reconsidering friendship. If you hit your head badly enough to forget the term, tell the nurse. If this is performance, do it after breakfast. Then he turned, grabbed his jacket and walked out. I stood there in Adrian Voss's room wearing somebody else's body and a school uniform that probably cost more than my previous monthly grocery budget, and it finally hit me in one clean wave. I was inside the story, not at the start of the universe, not before the romance, right in the middle of the academy setup arc, where everyone still pretended the whole thing was about tests, etiquette, and family rankings while fate quietly arranged people like furniture. I found the mirror over the washstand and met Julian Mercer for the first time. He looked better than I ever had, which was insulting under the circumstances. Brown hair, a little too soft at the ends, warm face, honest eyes, the kind of smile line that suggested other people trusted him before he even earned it. He was pretty in the dangerous way side characters usually are, pretty enough to make the audience feel something, not important enough for the plot to protect. I touched my cheek. The reflection copied me exactly. Same motion, same confusion, same wrong life. Behind me a bell rang. Somewhere deep in the house. I should explain the story a little before I explain what I did to it. The guide to becoming the male lead was, on the surface, a ridiculous school romance. Elite boarding academy, noble air, scholarship student, hidden club rooms, seasonal dances, 7 campus mysteries, one academically gifted female lead who kept solving everyone else's emotional problems while failing to notice she was adorable, One male lead who looked like he had been raised by etiquette manuals and winter moonlight. One second lead from an equally prestigious family who was funny, bright, socially perfect, and doomed by the genre to become useful pain. The actual engine of the story was social gravity. Who got seen, who got chosen, who stood next to the light, and who only reflected it. Julian, from what I remembered, existed to keep everything moving. He knew everyone, smoothed tension, helped Yuna settle in, dragged Adrian out of his shell, and accidentally became the most emotionally competent person in a story designed to punish exactly that trait. Readers loved him and joked that he needed a union, a therapist, or a promotion. The title was a joke about that. The guide, the promotion, the impossible little fantasy that if the wrong person understood romance deeply enough, maybe he could step out of side character gravity and become the lead. I did not remember every chapter. That was the first bad sign. I remembered beats, vibes, comment, the order of some of the mysteries, the spring festival confession fake-out, the rooftop rain scene, Julian covering for Yuna one too many times and then smiling like it did not cost him anything, nothing that would save me if the plot expected precision. The door opened before I finished panicking. A maid, not old, not stern, just frighteningly efficient, stepped in carrying a blazer over one arm and said, "Master Mercer asked me to remind you that if you miss assembly again, he will stop lying for you. Master Mercer, your father," she looked at my face, "do not tell me you forgot him before exams. That would be disrespectful in a very creative way." I took the blazer before she could notice my hands shaking. By the time I reached the lower dining room, I had learned 3 useful things. 1. Julian's family was wealthy enough to maintain a townhouse near the academy for term use instead of making him stay in the dorms full time. 2. Julian apparently had a reputation for sleeping late, charming his way out of consequences, and turning every authority figure half tired instead of fully angry. 3. His father was exactly the kind of elegant, terrifying man who could destroy your life before breakfast and still fold his napkin beautifully. He looked at me over the newspaper and said, "If Voss had not sent word that you were on your feet, I would have assumed you had fled the country to avoid arithmetic. Good morning to you too." The answer came out before I could decide whether Julian usually bantered with his father or whether I had just committed social suicide. Mr. Mercer lowered the paper very slowly. Then, to my absolute shock, one corner of his mouth moved. "There he is," he said. I was beginning to worry. The academy had finally replaced my son with a devotional pamphlet. So Julian's father liked him. Good, that was emotionally useful. It also meant any change in behavior would be noticed faster. I ate quickly, listened more than I spoke, and learned the rest on the carriage ride to school. Midterm term, festival season approaching, scholarship review pressure rising, Yuna Bell, the scholarship girl everybody had started talking about after she placed first in written magic. History, Adrian Voss newly transferred back into the central house after years away. Julian caught between family expectations, prefect politics, and the fact that he apparently signed up for too many committees because he couldn't say no if someone looked stressed. That last part hit hard enough to make me stare out the window. Some habits survive reincarnation. The academy itself looked exactly like a romance comic would design if it had access to a cathedral, a castle, and no municipal budget oversight, towers, long windows, 4 connected wings around a stone courtyard with a dry fountain in the middle, ivy everywhere, students crossing the grounds in dark uniforms with house-colored ribbons at the sleeves, the kind of place built to make normal people feel underqualified just for existing. The second I stepped onto the front stairs, somebody shouted, "Julian, if you disappear before lunch again, I'm telling the debate club you died." A girl with a crooked tie and enough energy to power a district came running up the steps 2 at a time. Myra. Side friend, comic relief with hidden observation skills. I remembered her because my roommate once said she was the only character who behaved like she had internet access. She hooked her arm through mine before I could respond and pulled me into motion. "You look weird," she said. I got dragged out of bed by fate. That is not new. I mean literally. That is unfortunately also not new. This was the first good thing that happened to me, not the line itself. The rhythm, the speed, being dragged into an existing friendship so fast my panic had to chase after me instead of leading. That became the pattern of the day. People knew Julian, everyone knew Julian. The librarian nodded at And like she expected trouble, 2 younger students waved because he had apparently helped them with debate registration. A prefect threatened him over paperwork and then secretly asked him to cover a shift at the evening fundraiser. 3 girls in my class moved over to make space at the table the second I arrived. It was like inheriting social credit built by a much better man and realizing I was going to spend the rest of the day trying not to bankrupt it, and then I saw her. Yuna Bell was standing at the notice board under the east archway, one hand full of books, one brow furrowed, reading a list of elective placements like the paper had personally insulted her. In the comics she always looked composed. On fan edits she looked luminous. In real motion she looked like a tired girl trying to solve 3 problems at once before the first bell. Loose dark hair, sharp, searching eyes, ink on her finger. She was beautiful, yes, but in a way that got swallowed by the more interesting thing, she was busy. The story usually made female leads look like fate. In person she looked like effort. And Julian, meaning the version of him I now had to embody, already knew her well enough to walk straight up and say, "You're reading the same line like it owes you money." She looked over, relief flashed first, then annoyance at being observed. The elective list changed. That sounds like the school's way of saying sorry in advance. They moved my chemistry practical the same hour as student archive duty. Can't have you becoming too powerful. I was not powerful to begin with. Incorrect, you have handwriting people trust. That got the laugh. Small, immediate. Apparently Julian knew how to do that without effort. Great, terrible, impossible. To fake forever, she showed me the form. I did not really need to read it. What I needed was the reminder. Julian helps, Yuna asks. He fixes things if he can, jokes if he can't, and somehow turns up beside plot pressure exactly when the story needs a bridge. I should have stayed on script. Instead I asked, "What do you actually want to take?" She blinked. "What? Not what they gave you. What would you pick if nobody was trying to manage your schedule?" It was a small question. I asked it because it was honest, because I hated the list on site, because I have always had a bad habit of reaching one layer under whatever people say first. The problem was that Julian in the story usually moved sideways, not inward. He made things easier. He did not ask the one question that made people show you their real face. Yuna looked at me differently after that, not romantically, more dangerously, like I had become slightly less safe to categorize. Field cartography, she said after a second, and applied rune construction. Then let's go ruin someone's morning. That was how I met the female lead properly, on the way to the registrar's office, carrying half her books because she had too many and pretending I was still just a funny second lead in a story I had no right to disturb. The registrar, naturally, was a minor tyrant with half-moon glasses and a personal hatred of student requests. She tried to dismiss Yuna before she finished her sentence. She made the mistake of looking at me and assuming I was there to charm rather than insist. Julian must have done that lot. I could feel the expectation in the room like furniture already arranged before I sat down. So I changed the rhythm. No jokes, no smile. I laid the timetable flat, pointed at the conflict, pointed at her own departmental stamp, and asked whether the academy had decided scholarship students should choose between academic advancement and mandated labor, because that would be very useful to know before the review board met. Yuna stared at me. The registrar stared at me, too. Students waiting behind us stared at me. Then the registrar coughed, reshuffled the forms, and said, "There might be one possible adjustment if Miss Bell had not yet confirmed archive duty in writing." We got the schedule changed in under 6 minutes. Outside the office, Yuna stopped walking and looked at me like she was checking whether I had been body swapped by a more competent ghost. "You usually flirt with authority until it gets tired," she said. "Maybe I'm experimenting with horizontal violence." That sounded almost political. "I'm trying new hobbies." Her mouth twitched. "Well, thank you." The thanks should have been easy to accept. It was, not because I didn't want it, because it landed in the wrong place. I was not helping her as Julian exactly. I was helping her as myself, wearing Julian's easier face, and I had no idea whether that difference was going to save this story or snap it in half. So I did what frightened people do when they want control. I moved to the next thing, asked about class, asked whether archive duty was always that badly managed, asked whether the rumored 7 mysteries were actually worth caring about or just academy marketing with better lighting. That got another different look. You don't care about the Mysteries, she said. I care about why everyone cares about the mysteries. That is worse. Thank you. That was when Adrian appeared. He did not enter scenes, he altered them. That was the annoying part. He came down the corridor with a prefix badge on one sleeve, a file under one arm, and the expression of a man already half suspicious of the noise around him. In the comic, his beauty is always framed through contrast, cold against warmth, order against chaos, precision against feeling. In person, the more dangerous thing about Adrian Voss was that he paid attention. Not performatively, structurally. You got the sense he noticed where every person in a room stood. And what that said about them before he said a single word. He stopped in front of us. Bell. Mercer, 2 names, no decoration, somehow more intimate than a greeting. Yuna lifted the revised schedule slip a little. The registrar made a correction. She made an exception, Adrian said. After one glance at the stamp, she made an error first, I said. His eyes shifted to me. And you corrected her? I assisted the correction heroically against paperwork. One heartbeat, too. Then Adrian said, try not to start a revolution before second period. It creates filing issues. And walked off. That line alone explained why readers forgave him all his emotional crimes. Day kept moving. Literature with Madame Rue, who had clearly adored Julian's ability to speak before. Thinking as long as the answers remained clever. Ethics lecture with Professor Ain, who treated every question like a knife and was disappointed when students used them as spoons. Lunch in the South Courtyard where 3 different circles expected Julian to sit with them, and Myra solved the crisis by stealing my tray and declaring me public property. I learned fast that Julian's life had no empty edges. He was always in motion, someone always needed something. Notes delivered, commit. Rooms unlocked, club dispute mediated, faculty rumor translated into student language. He was not central because the story loved him most. He was central because the whole school had quietly learned to root friction through him. It explained the title better than any fan joke ever had. If you wanted to become the male lead, first you had to stop being infrastructure. That thought stayed with me into the evening because the first mystery arrived before dinner, not dramatically. Through a key, Yuna found me in the library annex after club hours, where I had gone to check whether the campus map on the wall matched what I remembered from the comic. She held up a tarnished brass key and said, "Did you leave this in my notebook?" "No." "Then someone wants me to think you did." Promising start. The key had a number stamped on the spine. East Tower, old music rooms. In the story, the 7 mysteries weren't supernatural exactly. They were the Academy's way of hiding old damage under tradition, rumor, and selective memory. Missing records, locked spaces. Night bells, the girls' dorm window that was always open on the wrong floor, the founder portrait that changed expression depending on who lied beneath it. Most of them were social mechanisms disguised as ghost stories. A few weren't. Yuna wanted to return the key to lost property. I wanted to know who had planted it and why it had been tied to me, which meant I also wanted to know whether the story had already started using Julian as a tool more actively than I remembered. So of course, we went to the East Tower, because bad choices become easier when they are plot-shaped. The old music room sat above the rehearsal hall, up a narrow service staircase nobody used because the modern practice wings were on the south side, and the east corridor lights always dimmed too early. We climbed with one small library lamp between us, Yuna in front because she hated when men tried to direct her away from danger for her safety, me behind because I had enough genre awareness to know second leads die when they insist on going first for symbolic reasons. The key fit room 3E on the first try. Inside there was no ghost, no piano playing itself, no blood-written clue. There were files, boxes and folders stacked under dusty cloth, some tied with old academy seals, some newer, some marked with scholarship, review numbers and family names I recognized from noble houses on the donor wing. Yuna went still the second she saw the labels. These should be in the Mercer archive. She said, that sounds like the kind of sentence that turns into a problem. It sounds like someone moved them where nobody would look. We opened one box, scholarship evaluations, withdrawal letters, financial exceptions, recommendation overrides, half the social map of the academy hidden upstairs under dead sheet music. Then we heard the door close behind us. I turned too slowly. Adrian was standing there with his hand still on the handle and an expression that said 2 things at once. He had suspected something, and whatever he had suspected was not this, for one stupid. Second, nobody spoke. Then Adrian looked at the open box, at the key in Yuna's hand, at me, and said, "Explain why this room contains the review board's missing records." I wanted to say I'd had a rough 48 hours, and the universe was being repetitive. Instead, I lifted both hands and said, "The short version, or the version that keeps us from getting expelled." We took the version that avoided expulsion, mostly because Adrian, for all his moral frostbite, was not stupid enough to miss what the boxes meant. Half the Academy's scholarship and placement decisions had been routed through hidden review packets, which meant someone had been quietly manipulating rankings, room assignments, club access, and faculty recommendations behind the scenes. The romance comic version of the Academy was all glances and slow emotional burns. The administrative version, apparently, was favoritism wearing old stationery. Yuna knelt beside the second box like she had forgotten to breathe. Adrian flipped through 3 folders in complete silence and then asked which one of us had told anyone about the key. We both said no at once. He nodded once, as if that answered a much larger question. The next 15 minutes changed our shape as a group more than any confessions ever could have. Not emotionally, functionally. Yuna read fast and retained everything. Adrian built structure out of chaos. The second evidence hit his hands. I saw patterns the story itself had hidden under genre lighting, because I was looking sideways at the machinery instead of directly at the romance. It was the first time I stopped feeling like a side character borrowing agency and started feeling like a dangerous kind of witness. The hidden files linked dozens of random student outcomes to donor pressure and prefect recommendations. It explained why some scholarship students vanished between terms without scandal, why certain noble heirs kept landing top committee spots after mediocre exams, why Julian in the original story was always fixing social fallout instead of questioning the architecture producing it. The school did not just reward leads and punish supporting roles in the romantic sense, it did it administratively. The Academy was a plot engine because someone had built it that way. Yuna looked up from one folder and said very quietly, "They reassigned 4 students after the winter review and marked it as temperament adjustment." Adrian took the file from her, read the margin notes, and his jaw tightened just enough to show he was actually angry. Temperament means they were inconvenient to someone. Can we maybe promote that phrase to openly corrupt? I asked. Neither of them argued. That was when footsteps hit the stair outside. Not one person, multiple, deliberate, unhurried in. The way people move when they think the room is already theirs. Adrian blew out the library lamp. Immediately, good instinct, terrible atmosphere. Moonlight through the high windows cut the room into silver bars and shadow. I could hear paper under my hand, Yuna shifting her weight, Adrian stepping between us and the door without even thinking about it. That annoyed me on principle and reassured me on a much more embarrassing level. The handle turned once, locked, good, then a voice outside said, "Open it, we know someone is in there." Not faculty, student, upperclassman male. Practiced authority, rich enough to think doors obeyed tone. Adrian's face changed, not surprise. Recognition. "Head prefect Marius," he mouthed. Of course it was a prefect, in stories about academies, corruption either lives at the top or recruits very efficiently from the middle. The second voice outside was female and flatter. "If Mercer is in there, this becomes easier." That one turned my stomach, because it meant Julian's usual role in the school had already made him a useful lever, not because he was important enough to eliminate first, because he was accessible enough to control. I leaned toward Adrian and whispered, "You know the side windows?" He nodded. "Can they fit a person?" He looked at the frame, looked at me. "You first." "Absolutely not," Yuna in the dark whispered. "Stop deciding masculinity and solve the room." "Fair." The old music rooms had one useless decorative fireplace, 2 cabinets, a piano with 3 dead keys, and a narrow maintenance casement window behind the curtain. Adrian got it open in 6 seconds. I checked the drop-in. Regretted being born, dying, and being reborn all at once. Not fatal, just insulting. The footsteps outside moved. A metal tool hit the lock. We were out of time. Yuna went first because she was smallest and most likely to land well. I held the curtain aside while Adrian boosted her through. Then I went because somebody had finally managed to weaponize my self-preservation more strongly than my pride. The landing tore skin off my palm and half my dignity with it. Adrian came down last. Not because he was noble, but because he was the only one who could close the window from that outside and make the exit take longer to read. Important distinction. We ran blind across the lower roofline over the old rehearsal wing, while voices behind us changed from controlled to furious. Somebody had expected to find witnesses trapped in a room full of paperwork. Instead, they got 3 idiots scrambling over slate under moonlight with stolen evidence stuffed under my blazer. The drop at the far side led to the covered colonnade above the east cloister. Yuna jumped first because apparently she had no intention of letting either of us control the pace just because we were taller. Adrian followed. I followed badly, hit the stone harder than planned, and rolled into a decorative column with enough force to make the academy architecture personally memorable. By the time we reached the lower courtyard, no one was speaking in complete sentences anymore. We ended up in the greenhouse annex, because it was the only place on the east side with both cover and warm light after curfew. Wet glass overhead, herbs on the shelves, soil under the benches. It smelled like mint, damp earth, and the kind of honesty plants maintain by never pretending to be more than alive. We dumped the folders on the potting table like war loot. Yuna's hands were shaking. Adrian noticed before I did. He moved to the water basin, filled a cup, and set it by her without making a scene about it. Again, unfairly effective behavior. I leaned both hands on the table and said, "Well, the academy is evil." Lazy summary, Adrian said, "Then improve it." His eyes flicked to mine. Someone has been engineering student movement through donor access, scholarship pressure, and prefect oversight for years. Better, Yuna finally spoke. Why would they hide the files in a room tied to one of the campus mysteries? Because if anyone found them, I said, they could dismiss it as students chasing stories. She looked at me. Adrian looked at me too. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when 2 intelligent people realize you are not only more useful than expected, but useful in a direction they had not already mapped. I should have played it lighter instead. I said, the mysteries aren't just atmosphere, they're camouflage. And from that point on, whatever version of Julian Mercer the academy thought it knew started dying quietly in place. We did not sleep. That turned out to be the first smart thing we did after several dumb ones. Adrian took the records that could tie directly to prefect tampering. Yuna copied scholarship lists, donor annotations by hand because she trusted paper more than official seals now. I handled cross-reference logs, mostly because I had spent one entire life in institutions where the truth always hid in boring columns and mismatched dates. By dawn, we had enough to prove manipulation and nowhere safe to take it. Going to faculty was a joke. The files implicated faculty oversight. Going the headmistress blind was just a slower way to announce we had found the knife and were waiting politely to be stabbed with it. Adrian wanted to move through formal channels anyway because he had been raised to believe systems fail by error before they fail by design. Yuna wanted to go to the scholarship council because she still believed some adults could be forced to behave if the evidence was clean enough. I wanted to ask which one of them had ever watched a committee survive a scandal without trying to eat the witness first. That argument did something useful. It forced us to name our real roles. Adrian was not the cold lead because he lacked feelings. He was cold because structure was the only way he knew to love anything without losing control of it. Yuna was not kind because she was soft. She was kind because she believed institutions should answer to people and kept trying to act as if that were still possible. And me, I was not a side character because I was emotionally safe. I was a side character because I had trained myself to be useful in motion while never asking who benefited from the motion. I think that was the exact hour I started wanting the promotion for real, not romance, not the spotlight position. I was tired of being built for other people's plot efficiency. The next school day felt normal on the surface, which made it more dangerous. Attendance, bell schedule, Latin quiz, a dual roomer in the South Quad, tea in the faculty lounge drifting into the lower hall. The machine kept moving while the 3 of us carried enough evidence to break one of its hidden gears. More than once I caught someone watching me too carefully. Upper prefects, one bursar clerk, Myra, who had no idea what was happening but knew with terrifying accuracy that I was lying by omission. At lunch, she sat across from me, stole half my apple slices and said, "If you're about to do something stupid, at least let me pick the shoes wear for it." I'm always doing something stupid. No, usually you're doing something socially Useful and strategically bad, different category. I nearly laughed because of how perfectly she had described Julian in one line. Then I realized she was studying me, not joking. What changed? She asked quietly. I looked at the courtyard, the prefect tables, the scholarship students under the West Arch, the donor banners hanging over the seasonal garden committee display. Then I answered. More honestly than I planned. I got tired of being easy to use. She did not understand the whole sentence. She understood enough. That was Myra's real talent. She nodded once and said, good, you were getting overqualified for being everyone's emergency person. That line stayed with me because it reframed the whole title in a way the comic itself had only hinted at. The guide, the promotion. The secret was never that Julian needed to become Adrian. It was that Julian needed to stop treating his own position as permanent just because the world found it convenient. The breakthrough came through a stupid tradition. Every month the Academy held the House Arbitration Forum, public grievances, budget disputes, schedule conflicts, student petition. It was supposed to model civic decorum. In practice, it was where class politics put on uniforms and tried to sound educational. Perfect place, in other words, to make hidden power visible without framing it as rebellion. Yuna brought up the forum. Adrian immediately hated it, which was how I knew it was strong. I loved it. For the same reason, if we went private, we could be buried. If we went public without structure, we'd be dismissed as emotional. But if the first move happened inside an Academy sanction mechanism designed for cross-house review, then anyone trying to shut it down too fast would expose their own stake. It was beautiful administrative violence, my native tongue. We spent 48 hours preparing not a speech, a trap, one housing petition tied to donor privilege, one scholarship discrepancy presented as a procedural inquiry, one question about prefect review authority that Adrian could raise without sounding personal, one supporting log from old archive transfers, one naming sequence leading, if pressed, toward the hidden records upstairs without exposing all of our evidence at once. The point was not to win the forum. The point was to force someone corrupt to overreact in public. The whole time, the emotional side of the original comic kept trying to crawl back into the center, and I kept refusing it. Yes, there were glances. Yes, there were moments. Yuna falling asleep over a copied file for 20 minutes in the library annex, while Adrian draped his blazer over the back of her chair and pretended not to care when I noticed Adrian catching me after I slipped on the cloister stairs because I was reading 3 columns of transfer dates while walking like an idiot, me making Yuna laugh so hard over donor house flower politics that she had to hide behind a ledger. All of that mattered. It just was not the engine. Right now, if I let the story slow down to admire chemistry before I fixed the machine shaping that chemistry, then I was right back where the original Julian had always lived, emotionally essential, structurally powerless. So we went to the forum with cleaner uniforms, dirty evidence, and every intention of making at least one rich child cry before dinner. The hall was packed. Of course it was. Public grievance is the nearest thing elite students have to Bloodsport. Representatives from all 4 houses, faculty observers, prefects lined along the side wall like decorative enforcement. Donor proxies in the balcony because apparently class hierarchy needs stadium seating. Myra sat 3 rows back with the expression of someone who knows the meal is about to arrive and cannot wait to see if it bites first. The first 3 petitions were useless. Garden access, uniform hem, regulations, lab usage scheduling. Then Adrian stood, requested cross-house procedural review, and the room changed. That was the thing about being the male lead in a proper academy narrative. Adrian did not need volume. He had gravity. Once he asked for review of prefect oversight in scholarship-based disciplinary routing, every head in the hall turned. Then Yuna stood and added that scholarship timetables had been repeatedly altered without corresponding faculty signatures. Then I stood. Julian Mercer, smiling second lead, social lubricant committee fixer general Purpose Bridge, stood in the center aisle and asked why the East Tower Review Archive had boxes of buried student files tied to donor recommendations no public index recognized. The silence after that felt earned. 3 prefects moved at once. Wrong choice, too fast, exactly what we wanted. Adrian said calmly, sit down. One prefect froze because when Adrian Voss uses that tone, half the Academy remembers mortality. The other 2 kept moving. That was when Yuna placed the coppet ledger sheets on the petition table under full view of the observers and said, "If this is an administrative misunderstanding, then we can resolve it publicly." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The whole hall split at the spine, students leaning in, faculty trying not to show alarm, donor proxy on the balcony signaling someone behind the curtain, head prefect Marius standing too still by the wall, Myra staring at me like I had finally become interesting enough to justify all her patience. What came next was not immediate justice. Again, better, it was panic. Trying to remain elegant, one master requested adjournment, another requested document verification. A prefect called the copies unauthorized. Adrian asked whether unauthorized meant false or merely inconvenient. Yuna asked whether scholarship records were now a private house matter instead of an academy one. I asked whether the East Tower room should be opened right now in front of witnesses, or whether the administration preferred to explain why it existed later under oath. That last word was technically excessive, worth it. Within 7 minutes the forum had stopped being a school event and turned into a controlled institutional fire. Within 20, the headmistress herself arrived, and the second she walked in, I knew the arc had changed. Headmistress Solène looked like the sort of woman who had never once raised her voice because entire generations had already learned to fear the moment before she might. Tall, white hair pinned back without decoration, dark robes cut so cleanly they looked almost military. She took one look at the petition table, one look at the copies, one look at the prefect line and said, "Nobody moves." When people in weak positions say that, it sounds hopeful. When she said it, the hall obeyed before the sentence finished existing. She read the top sheet in silence, then the next. Then she asked Adrian where the originals were. Nobody lied. That was the second major turn in the story. Not because authority arrived to save us. Because for the first time since I woke up in Julian's body, authority arrived and did not immediately belong to the wrong side. Solène did not protect us. She protected the process of exposure, which in an academy like this was almost more radical. The East Tower room was open that afternoon under full witness. Faculty recorders, house observers, too. City clerks called in so nobody could later claim internal tampering. The hidden archive came out, box by box into public light, while the student body turned the courtyard into a rumor storm so dense it probably altered bird migration patterns. Marius tried to resign before questions reached him. Denied. The bursar clerk fainted, which I considered dramatically unhelpful but thematically satisfying. By evening, 6 suspensions had been issued and 3 donor families were threatening to withdraw support unless the matter was handled with nuance, which, translated from the dialect of wealth, means bury the poor witnesses before the dinner guests arrive. We should have been safe. In that moment, we were, because stories do not like power vacuums, they fill them that night after 12 straight hours of testimony, copied logs, corridor strategy, and one deeply uncomfortable but necessary dinner with Headmistress Solène. I finally went to the library annex. Alone because my head needed silence. I was halfway down the side aisle between astronomy shelves when a hand closed over my mouth and dragged me into the narrow service gap behind the catalog cabinets. I reacted on instinct. Elbow back, heel down, twist out. The grip broke before I finished the turn. Celestine, no, not Celestine. Wrong story, wrong manipulator, wrong silk. Leora, head prefect of the girls' hall, caught my wrist mid-motion and hissed, "If you scream, I leave you." With the warning instead. That line was strong enough to earn stillness. Leora had always been a side threat in the comic, too composed, too politically literate, the kind of prefect readers distrusted because she smiled like she kept a knife inside her etiquette manual. She looked worse up close, not villainous, tired, angry in a disciplined way. Marius wasn't the top, she said. He was a gatekeeper. Then she pressed a folded note into my hand and stepped back before I could ask anything useful. Midnight, observatory stare. Bring Voss and Bell if you want them alive longer. Then she was gone. I stared at the note for maybe 3 full seconds, which was far too long. Considering the wording, the observatory stair was not one of the 7 mysteries officially. Readers had always treated it like the hidden 8th, narrow stone staircase up the oldest tower. Sealed after a fall 50 years earlier, accessible only through a locked astronomy passage nobody had a key to, and everybody had a rumor about. Exactly the kind of place people in these stories use when they need truth wrapped in danger and bad weather. We were there at 11:58. Of course we were. Adrien wanted to bring guards. Yuna wanted to bring Solène. I wanted both. We brought neither, because Leora's message had said alive longer, which was exactly the kind of manipulative wording that works on people who have already spent a day dragging corruption into open air. If we moved too publicly, whoever sat above Marius vanished. If we moved too casually, we died. So we took the middle path all doomed students take. We prepared badly but sincerely. Yuna had copied the most critical files and left sealed packets with Myra and one faculty aide she trusted. Adrien had his house blade under his coat, because rules become decorative at a certain level of threat. I had a lantern, a crowbar stolen from maintenance, and more willingness to ruin expensive architecture than I had possessed in any previous life. Leora was waiting inside the first landing. Not in prefect uniform, in plain dark clothes, no badge, no house pin, which meant she was either about to save us or betray us more honestly than usual. She chose a third option. She told us that hidden archive was not about grades, it was about succession, not royal succession, narrative succession in the institutional sense. The academy had been quietly managed for decades to produce certain pairings of students, certain alliances between houses, certain public faces attractive to donors, and certain sacrificial scandals that allowed old power to purge weak branches without losing prestige. The school loved mysteries because mysteries trained students to romanticize missing information. The school loved central couples because central couples made the social map legible and marketable. Side characters, scholarship students, funny boys, dutiful girls, and difficult heirs did the labor that kept the core image moving. I almost laughed when she said it, because it sounded too close to genre criticism to be true. Then she handed Yuna a donor ledger with 3 highlighted names, and all the laughter died. One of those names was Adrian's uncle. One belonged to the Bell Scholarship Foundation's legal trustee, and one, somehow, belonged to Julian Mercer's father. I do not remember moving. I only remember hearing myself say no. Leora's face didn't change. Your father funded the Social Placement Bureau 2 terms ago, whether knowingly or not I cannot yet prove. Yet, that word hurt more than the accusation. Adrien went cold in the way he did when his emotions had become dangerous enough to require external winter. Yuna did not speak at all, and me, for the first time since waking up in Julian's body, I felt the promotion twist into something uglier. It was one thing to steal agency from a story. It was another to realize your own borrowed family might be one of the hands writing it. That would have been enough for a whole act. Then someone started climbing the stair below us. More than one someone. Metal on stone. No rush, no panic. The confidence of people who already know where the door is and assume the room on the other side belongs to them. Leora swore under her breath, drew a narrow knife from her boot, and said, "Now you finally get to decide whether you want the lead role badly enough." I had wanted less reflection, less long thinking, more movement. The story apparently had agreed. The first man through the stair door was not Marius. That would have been simpler. Marius walked in second, pale and composed, and already angry that the room was not arranged for his control. The first man wore no academy colors at all, dark coat, gloves, no crest pin, older than student, younger than a master, the kind of age institutions like to borrow when they need violence. That still passes for deniability. He looked past me, past Yuna, and settled on Adrien with the flat attention of someone who had been given a hierarchy before he entered the room. Useful, terrible, informative. The next 2 behind him were senior prefect aides I recognized only from corridor traffic. One broad enough to make the stair feel smaller, one narrow-faced and careful, the type who usually holds doors open for guests and later testifies that nobody was forced. Leora did not wait for introductions. She moved first, knife flashing low toward the wrist of the man in front, and the whole landing snapped from threat into action, so fast my body gave up on thinking and chose motion. Instead, the broad aide shoved the door wide and reached for Yuna because of course he did. Stories always go for the girl with the evidence first and the girl with the voice second. I hit him with the crowbar before the logic fully formed, not on the head, shoulder, hard enough to break his angle and make him swear. Adrien went for the older man in the coat, and that was the first time I saw him fight. Outside academy drills, not prettier, cleaner. He cut space away from the other man like he had been taught by people who believed elegance should leave bruises. Yuna did the smartest thing on the Landing, she did not freeze. She grabbed the donor ledger off the stair rail where Leora had set it, shoved it under her jacket, and kicked the narrow-faced aide in the knee with the kind of fury only scholarship girls and younger sisters learn properly. Leora shouted, "Upper access," and ran toward the observatory door. I hated that she was right. The landing was too narrow, the stairs too exposed, and if more people came from below, we would end up trapped between evidence and architecture, so I followed her. Adrian backed up one step at a time while keeping the older man off balance. Yuna slipped past me, breathing hard, eyes wide and bright in that way that meant she was scared enough to become precise. We got through the observatory door with 1 second to spare. Adrian slammed it shut behind us and threw the bolt just as someone hit the other side from the stairwell. The observatory was not what I expected. The comic always drew it like a Gothic secret room. Moonlight, dust, ancient telescope, maybe a meaningful scarf on a hook somewhere. The real place looked like a beautiful argument between scholarship and neglect, stone floor, domed ceiling, brass instrument frames under white cloths. Star charts rolled into tubes beside cracked cabinets, windows high enough to make the night feel like it had been invited in but not domesticated. There was a central mechanism in the floor under a glass disc etched with constellations, half decorative, half machine, entirely the kind of thing Academy founders build when they want future generation to believe beauty excuses control. Leora ran straight to the center platform and crouched by the brass ring around the glass disc. "There's a secondary stair," she said, "maintenance shaft behind the chart table, but if we run, they lock the outer access and call us guilty before dawn." "That sounds bad," I said. "That is because it is." Another hit landed against the bolted door. Wood cracked near the frame. Adrian crossed the room in 3 fast steps, checked the side windows, then the shaft Leora had named, then the mechanism under the floor. He was doing the thing he did best, turning panic into geometry. "How many know about this room?" he asked. Leora did not look up. "Active 5 officially, none." "Then if they force the door and find us here with the files, they say we stole them," Yuna finished. "And because they arrived through student channels, the board can bury the archive under misconduct." Her voice was steady. I noticed because mine was not. The bolt shuddered again. I looked at the brass mechanism under Leora's hands and asked the only useful question available. "What is that?" She finally looked at me. "The Founder's Sky Engine, ceremonial astronomy display, also the lock to the old record transit chute." I blinked. The Academy has a record transit chute under the observatory. It had one, before the school learned that paper disappears more quietly when people think it never moved at all. I laughed once because it was either that or scream. This place is just bureaucracy with expensive windows. Adrian pointed at the Sky Engine. "Can it open?" "Yes." "Can it drop the original archive into a place the whole school can't ignore?" Leora stared at him for half a heartbeat. Then, for the first time since she dragged us into this, she smiled, not warmly, with recognition. "You really are his friend," she said, and for one dangerous second, I was not sure whether she meant Julian or me. The plan came together ugly and fast. Leora would open the Founder's chute. Yuna would take the copied ledgers and go down the maintenance stair to Headmistress Solen's private clerical office, because if anyone in this building could turn an ambush into procedure before dawn, it was Solen. Adrian and I would stay, not because he got to play male lead with a sword and I got to be supportive furniture, because the men outside wanted 2 things, the records and a body they could put a story around. If we made enough noise, enough delay, enough visible damage, then even if they lied later, the lie would have to work too hard. That more than romance is what separates background from lead. Visibility, cost, the ability to make silence expensive. I did not enjoy realizing that in real time. Yuna hated leaving. She argued for almost 10 seconds, which was all we had. Adrian cut through it. "First bell." "Just that." She looked at him. He said, "Take the proof." No confession, no hand clasp, no violin string, just trust handed over in a single sentence because the room did not have time for prettier things. Then she looked at me. I wanted to say something clever because Julian in the comic always had something light ready when fear got too visible, but this had stopped being that kind of scene, so I told her the truth. If this goes bad, don't come back for us unless you're bringing Solène and 3 city clerks. That got the smallest, wildest almost laugh out of her. You sound horrible under pressure. I am evolving. You're getting louder. That too. Leora had the floor mechanism half open by then, the brass teeth clicking under the glass disc. Square of darkness yawned beside the platform, where old maintenance stairs dropped into the walls. Yuna hesitated exactly once, then disappeared into it with the copied ledgers under her jacket and all the scholarship fury in the world driving her feet. Adrian moved one cabinet in front of the observatory door. I moved another. Leora reset the brass ring and said, if they breach before the chute drops, aim for the older one. In the coat, he's not academy, he's bureau. You have a name for this? I asked. The Social Placement Bureau, she said, though the board tends to prefer words like stewardship. I tightened both hands on the crowbar. I hate everyone who named this. The door split at the frame. The older man in the coat forced his arm through first, reaching for the bolt. Adrian drove his blade through the gap just close enough to make the hand vanish back with a curse. The broad aid hit the wood with his shoulder. Once, twice, 3 times the frame cracked wider. Leora pulled a hidden lever under the sky engine. Something deep under the observatory groaned awake. And then we stopped being students hiding in a tower and became exactly what the academy had trained us never to be. Visible. When people later asked what the founder's chute sounded like, I always said it sounded like the school clearing its throat after 50 years of lying. The floor under the observatory gave a low metal groan, then a chain of distant impacts rolled down through the building like locked cabinets slamming open one after another. Somewhere beneath us, old gravity re-entered old design. Adrian looked at the mechanism, understood immediately what had happened, and then stepped back toward the door as the broad aid hit it again. This time the top hinge snapped free. The frame opened enough for a shoulder, then a face, then one furious eye. I brought the crowbar down on the gap before the thought finished crossing my head. It hit the splintered wood and the hand beyond it hard enough to send a yell through the room. Not graceful. Effective. I was getting fond of effective. The older bureau man did not waste motion. He kicked the broken hinge clear, shoved the broad aid side, and came in low with a short blade instead of forcing the whole entry. Professionals are so irritating that way. Adrian intercepted him before he reached me, steel against steel under a sky chart while the school's hidden records thundered through its walls. It was the least romantic version of destiny imaginable and therefore, to my mind, the most honest. Leora moved for the side flank, slicing at the narrow-faced aide as soon as he slipped through the gap. She fought like someone who had learned that elegance is a luxury and speed is rent. No wasted flourishes, no speech, just knife angles and brutal efficiency. She did not need saving, that was useful because I was busy not dying badly. The broad aid came at me second, close range, no blade. He wanted the body, not the blood, which told me I was still more leverage than target. I used the crowbar like I had been born in a maintenance closet and not in a modern city with too many PDF passwords. Elbow, wrist, knee. The third hit landed because he did not expect side characters to fight ugly. There is a real advantage in disappointing narrative assumptions at close quarters. The bureau man got through Adrian's guard once and cut his sleeve high near the shoulder. Adrian did not even look at the blood. That annoyed me so much I nearly got hit by the broad aid again. I ducked, drove the crowbar into his ribs with all the office resentment of 2 lifetimes, and then shouted something useless about carrying other people's paperwork. He did not seem moved. Some audiences lack sophistication. And the observatory windows blew open. Not from weather. From below. A burst of cold night air slammed into the room, carrying voices from the courtyard, 4 stories down, bells, shouts, running feet. Then another sound cut through all of it, Headmistress Solène, amplified somehow by the stone acoustics of the East Wing, ordering the entire academy to remain where it stood and witness. Leora laughed under her breath. The bureau man heard it too. That was the first time I saw real fear touch his face. He tried to disengage. Adrian refused the exit cleanly, forcing him away from the door and toward the sky engine. The broad aide made the opposite choice and lunged for me again, probably because he had decided grabbing one Mercer was still better than walking out empty-handed. He got both hands on my blazer and slammed me into the brass railing around the observatory disc hard enough to blur the room. Then something hot flashed under my ribs. Not magic exactly, not the kind readers would clip for edits and call awakening, more like a buried instinct finally realizing it was allowed to use the body it had been assigned. My hand came up. Faster than I meant it to. Not stronger than human, not impossible, just cleaner, more direct. I hit the broad aid once in the throat, twisted on the second beat, and used his own momentum to send him across the central platform into one of the star chart cabinets. The cabinet exploded into wood, rolled parchment, and a deeply satisfying amount of noise. For half a second, nobody moved. I stared at my own hands. The broad aide stared too. Then he coughed, tried to rise, and Leora knocked him back down with the hilt of her knife so hard I winced on principle. Later, she snapped at me without turning. Identity crisis after survival. Fair? The bureau man made his mistake then. Solen's voice below had changed the board. He no longer needed to retrieve quiet evidence. He needed to remove visible witnesses before the shape of the scandal settled. He dropped the pretense of containment and went straight for Adrian's throat. That probably would have worked against the version of Adrian, the comic introduced in early chapters, cold, guarded, overtrained into elegance, but by then he had spent enough time around Yuna's stubbornness, my bad influence, and his own betrayal to lose interest in looking noble while someone else wrote the rules. He let the bureau man come in, gave ground once, then stepped inside the angle instead of away from it, and drove him straight into the sky engine housing with his shoulder and forearm. The blade went spinning. The bureau man hit brass cursed, and that was the opening. I did not think. I grabbed the nearest thing with weight, one of the hanging brass constellation frames, and brought it down across the back of his arm. The impact rang through the dome. He dropped to one knee. Adrian looked at me like he had not fully updated my category since the breakfast room. Good. People should have to work for new information. The side door to the maintenance stair burst open at the same moment, and Yuna came back with two city clerks, one faculty recorder, and Headmistress Solen herself, moving like she had personally insulted every floor she walked across for slowing down. I felt relief first, then immediate irritation. I had told her not to come back without Solen and three clerks. She had brought Solen and two. No respect for precision. Solen took in the room in one sweep. Broken cabinets, bureau man restrained under Adrian's blade, and my improvised brass weapon, broad aid unconscious, narrow-faced prefect bleeding from the forearm where Leora had opened him, and currently trying to decide whether surrender or denial had better long-term odds. Then she looked at the door, the broken bolt, the hidden stair, and finally the sky engine. Good, she said. Not good job, not well done. Just good, in the tone of a woman confirming that the institution had finally coughed up the rot she had suspected was in its lungs. The city clerks immediately started writing. That was the moment the whole situation became unwinnable for the Bureau. Not because we had beaten them physically, because we had crossed the line from student scandal into documented civic procedure. Again, visibility, cost, lead energy. It is boring when you explain it. It is gorgeous when you weaponize it correctly. Solen had the older man shackled on the spot with an antiquated legal phrase that apparently still carried standing from the Academy charter. Yuna, breathing hard and furious enough to power the East Wing, spread the copied ledgers and the recovered originals across the chart table while the recorder documented every seal. Leora gave her statement with the expression of someone who had spent too long surviving under a machine and had finally decided she preferred the violence of truth to the management of lies. I was still bleeding lightly from one knuckle and trying to decide whether my body had just started changing or whether I had finally stopped fighting it wrong when Solen turned to me and said, "Mercer, explain why you were in the observatory before my prefects." Not what happened. Why before? That was a better question. So I told the truth with the useful parts first. The key, the hidden room, the records, the forum. The pressure chain, the way the Academy had used mysteries to hide movement. I did not sound clever. Good, clever would have made it easier to dismiss me as theatrical. I sounded tired and exact, which is how institutions most fear witnesses. By the time I finished, the city clerk nearest the chart Table had stopped pretending this was routine. None of that fixed the worst part. My father's name still sat in the donor ledger, and now there were official witnesses around it. When Solène asked whether I had known of the Mercer connection in advance, I heard myself answer no, and realized too late that I wanted her to believe me for reasons that had nothing to do with innocence and everything to do with grief. That was new. That was dangerous. And it meant the next battle was not going to happen in a tower. It was going to happen at home. The academy did not sleep after the observatory breach. Neither did the city. By morning, rumors had already escaped the walls in 3 different shapes. One version said the East Tower had housed a bribery archive tied to donor houses. Another said the academy's prefect board had been using scholarship placements as leverage in an old family dispute. A third, my favorite because of how stupid it was, insisted the founder's observatory had awakened because someone tried to kiss under the wrong constellation. That one was almost charming. Institutions collapse more slowly when romance is available as a cover story. Classes were suspended for 2 days. The headmistress called it a procedural review period. Students called it open season panic. Faculty called it a regrettable disruption to term order, which is how adults say the walls are moving, but I still expect papers on my desk by noon. I got maybe 4 hours of real sleep across those 2 days, all of it stolen in fragments, but statements, corridor politics, and one deeply cursed meal in the central refectory where every conversation around me stopped exactly half a beat too late. Myra sat across from me, ate half my roll without permission, and asked if I had joined a cult, a revolution, or both. I told her I was still taking applications for labels. She narrowed her eyes and said, "Good, because if this turns out to be a cult, I want seniority." Then, because she was Myra, she slid a folded note under my cup and got up before I could open it. The note had only one line. "Your father arrived an hour ago. No crest carriage. No announcement. Private entrance." That was somehow worse than a public visit. I stared at the note long enough for Adrian to notice. He had not changed since the observatory in any external way. Same straight posture, same controlled expression, same infuriating ability to look composed while the room around him did administrative cartwheels, but the edges had shifted. He watched more directly now, less as an observer, more as someone who had accepted that I was in the equation, whether or not he found that convenient. "Problem?" he asked. I handed him the note. He read it once and passed it back without comment. Then he said, "Do not go alone." It was not phrased as concern. That somehow made it more serious. Yuna, who had been pretending to read a copied ledger and failing, because she was clearly listening to every sound in the room, looked up immediately. "Where?" "Headmistress' office annex," I said, "or somewhere near it. Myra says he came through the private side." Yuna closed the file. "Then we all go." I wanted to argue. I also knew that if the donor ledger had reached Solène officially, then my father would not be here for emotional reconciliation and tea cakes. So we all went. The annex corridor behind Solène's private office had the atmosphere of old decisions and expensive rugs, not luxurious, controlled, dark wood, narrow windows, portraits of former headmasters staring down at the living with a kind of painted judgment, rich institutions confused with dignity. Solène was standing outside the smaller consultation room when we arrived. She looked at all 3 of us, took in our obvious intention to ignore normal boundaries, and made a face that was not approval but was close enough to permission to matter. "Mercer," she said, "only you." I took 1 step forward. Adrian moved with me. Solène's eyes shifted. He said, "If the donor ledger is under discussion, then 1 implicated witness and 2 corroborating ones are better than 1 isolated student under family pressure." She considered that. Then she looked at Yuna. Yuna said he should not have to answer alone for institutional decisions made over him. It was not a speech. It landed like one. Solène exhaled through her nose, which in her case counted as surrender. "Very well," she said. "But if this becomes melodrama, I will remove all 4 of you from my sight." That sounded fair. The consultation room looked exactly like the kind of room families used to decide whether honesty is Worth the inheritance, small fire, narrow table, 3 chairs, 1 standing cabinet with locked upper drawers. My father stood by the window, hands behind his back, still immaculate despite having apparently crossed half the city in private. He turned when we entered. His expression changed only once briefly when he saw that I had not come alone, then it shut again. "Headmistress," he said to Solène. "Master Mercer," she answered. Nobody greeted me. That was how I knew this was going to be real. Solène did not waste time. She placed the donor ledger copy on the table between us, touched the highlighted line with 1 finger, and asked whether he wished to contest the authenticity of the placement bureau records. He did not. That was bad. Then she asked whether he wished to deny financial contribution to the social placement bureau through the Cultural Continuity Fund rooted under the Academy Endowment Branch. He did not deny that either. I think some part of me had still been waiting for a misunderstanding. A forged line. A charity overlap. A bureaucratic coincidence. Instead, my father looked at the record and said, very calmly, "I funded what I was told was a student stability office." The room held still. "Explain stability," Solène said. He looked at me then, finally, and the thing in his face was not guilt first. It was calculation. Under strain, which somehow hurt worse. 12 years ago, he said, my eldest son became closely attached to a central house succession dispute at this academy. He was used as a public intermediary, then as a private witness, and then as a corrective embarrassment when the settlement failed. He left this institution alive and returned home with enough damage that he never became fully himself again. That sentence landed like cold water. Julian had an older brother. Of course he did. The comic had mentioned one once in passing. Family tragedy, background ache, the kind of line readers absorb as flavor and move on from because the current romance needs panel space. I had forgotten it completely. My father continued. When Julian was admitted, certain board members approached me with assurances. They said the school had changed. They said a stability bureau now existed to keep socially useful students from being drawn into central conflicts beyond their station. They said student placement, committee traffic, and disciplinary flow could be managed more safely. I paid because I believed what they implied, that some children could be protected if the institution became better at managing where they stood. Yuna went still in the way she did when anger had crossed into grief. Adrian's face did not move at all. I asked the question because nobody else could. And you never checked what they meant by managed. He looked at me without blinking. I checked enough to confirm your name stayed out of direct factional circulation. The worst part was that I understood the logic. Parents with money commit some of their ugliest sins through fear and paperwork. He had not paid to hurt the school broadly. He had paid to keep Julian from becoming central the way his brother had. To keep him smiling, social, useful, liked, and safely secondary. The whole room finally made sense. Why Julian was tolerated in every circle and prioritized in none. Why he was always needed and never really chosen. Why the title had to be a joke about promotion in the first place. The bureau had not only managed the school. It had managed him. I laughed once because anger was too clean for what I was feeling. So you outsourced my life into supporting cast positioning, I said. That is incredible, evil. Efficient but incredible. Julian. No. The word cut harder than I expected. He stopped. I stood there in his son's body with a dead student archive in my head, a stolen story under my skin, and the full shape of Julian Mercer's life, rearranging itself around one terrible ordinary truth. Nobody had needed to curse him into becoming useful. They had budgeted him into it. You paid to keep me safe, I said, hearing my own voice shake and hating it. Safe from consequence, safe from focus, safe from conflict, safe from becoming anything sharp enough to bleed in public. And somehow you never noticed that all you had really bought was permission for everyone else to keep taking pieces. My father's face finally cracked then. Only slightly. Enough. I noticed, he said. I told myself that surviving lesser harm was preferable to central ruin. There it was. The logic that builds tragic side characters out of living children. Not hatred. Fear dressed as strategy. Solène looked at him for a very long second. Then she said, "Master Mercer, your intention mitigates neither your contribution nor your negligence." Adrian shifted beside me, not to interrupt, to remain there. That mattered more than I wanted it to. Yuna spoke next. "Who approached you first?" My father answered without hesitation, "Chairwoman Vale's office liaison." The room changed shape again. Yuna did not react dramatically, but I saw the impact land all the way through her spine. Chairwoman Vale, not some side donor, her trustee chain, her house, the female lead's institutional shadow. Of course the story was widening. Of course it was personal for everyone now. My father was dismissed under formal inquiry order before noon, not arrested, not absolved, stripped of donor advisory standing pending review, and ordered not to contact student witnesses without Headmistress oversight. He took that with the expression of a man who had just realized the system he paid to soften had been using him as part of its architecture all along. As he passed me at the door, he stopped. I thought he would apologize. What he said instead was worse. "I thought remaining peripheral would let you live." Then he left, and I finally understood why the promotion mattered enough to hurt. It would have been nice if that revelation earned us a quiet day to process. The academy, tragically, had better comic timing than that. By mid-afternoon, the whole school knew 3 things. 1. The placement bureau was real. 2. Donor houses were implicated. 3. Julian Mercer had become relevant in the kind of way no parent can buy back into. Harmlessness. The emotional consequences arrived faster than the political ones. 2 committee heads suddenly stopped assuming I would smooth a conflict just because I was nearby. 3 noble girls who had always treated me like furniture started speaking to me with measured caution. Half the scholarship dorm greeted Yuna like she was carrying lit matches through a hay warehouse. Which, to be fair, she was. And Myra cornered me in the north colonnade between ethics and military history, shoved a meat bun into my hand and said, "You need food before your nervous system starts writing poetry." I'm not writing poetry. Exactly, that is how I know the situation is severe. And she asked whether my father had actually funded the machine that kept the school tilted. I asked her who had told her that. She pointed at the sky. Marius's cousin cried in the upper court, "People have ears." Fair. I told her the short version. She heard the long one anyway because Myra understood more from half a sentence than most prefects did from sworn testimony. When I finished, she said, "So the school is a matchmaking cult with ledgers. Administrative cult. Worse." Then she took the bun back, ripped it in half, gave me the larger piece and added, "For the record, I liked you before you became dangerous." That should not have mattered as much as it did. But after finding out, my entire social position had effectively been subsidized into harmlessness. Every clean little proof of unpurchased loyalty hit harder than expected. The strategic problem underneath all this was simpler. The bureau was damaged but not dead. Marius had names. The donor chain was exposed but not collapsed. Chairwoman Vale had not responded publicly, which meant she was either very innocent or very competent, and the academy did not contain enough miracles for me to assume the first option without evidence. Adrian's uncle had gone silent. That was the worst sign of all. People in power who intend to negotiate stay noisy. People who go quiet are usually moving pieces where your eyes are not. By evening, we had identified the shape of the next crisis. The spring selection banquet. Not the festival dance, not the public house gala, the closed donor dinner 2 nights before. Final committee appointments, mentorship routes, scholarship endorsements, and cross-house sponsorships were confirmed over silverware expensive enough to cause labor riots in a healthier genre. If the bureau still had a heart inside the academy, it was going to beat there. Because no matter how many ledgers we found, no matter how many inquiry seals Solène stamped, people like this do not stop managing the social map just because somebody catches one staircase full of records. They adapt. They choose a new center. And if the old system had spent years keeping Julian Mercer socially useful, but narratively peripheral, then the fastest way to stabilize after exposure would be to turn the banquet into a reset. Control who sits with whom. Control who gets publicly endorsed. Control which scandal replaces the last one. Control the camera angle of the story before it reaches the city. Once we understood that, the answer became ugly. We needed to get into the selection banquet. That was harder than climbing the observatory, and easier than surviving it would probably be. Yuna had no access. Scholarship students were only invited if they placed top 3 in public. Scholarship review or received donor commendation. Adrien had access automatically through house. Rank and prefix standing. I had access because the Mercers, despite everything, were still donor. Linked enough to be tolerated until formal disgrace ripened. Myra had no access and took that as a personal insult to democracy. Leora had access as prefect administration support, but said she preferred knives to dinner service. Again, fair. The first actual fight about the plan happened in the old fencing room behind the West Gym because apparently every conversation in this school needed architecture with trauma. Yuna wanted to enter through scholarship review and force visibility that way. Adrien wanted to use his standing to secure 2 student observer positions and keep the operation narrow. I wanted both because I had become greedy for leverage and tired of pretending otherwise. Leora wanted to burn the seating chart and start over from first principles, which was not technically impossible and therefore had to be discussed longer than anyone enjoyed. The argument would have gone in circles if Solène had not entered halfway through, watched us for 30 seconds and said, "Mercer is right." Silence. Not because she had agreed with me. Because she had done it in front of Adrien, which made the room feel briefly historical. She crossed to the fencing table, spread out the preliminary banquet roster, and tapped 3 names. With one finger. Adrian Voss. Julian Mercer. Chairwoman Vale's scholarship observer candidate, pending. There, she said, the Bureau will assume Voss is pressure, Mercer is noise, and the observer seat is controllable. That is what they understand. Therefore, that is where they will over-prepare. Yuna stepped closer. You can give me the observer seat. Solène looked at her. I can, they will know why. Then let them. No, I prefer surprises that leave records. Then she turned to me. It was not a comfortable look. It was an evaluating one. The Bureau trained this school to move around stable symbols, she said. You have become unstable. In exactly the correct direction. If we are going to force their hand, the banquet needs a disturbance they still think they understand until it is too late. I knew what she meant before she said it. I hated that I knew. You want me visible, I said. I want you central, she answered. That landed harder than any sword line so far. Not because it was flattering. Because it was the opposite of every arrangement Julian's life had been quietly funded into. Adrien saw it hit me, of course he did. Yuna did too. Neither of them rescued me from it. That was another kind of respect. So I asked the real question. What does central cost? Solène did not soften. Everything your father paid to avoid. There are sentences that change your blood pressure more effectively than magic. That was one of them. The plan that came out of that meeting was the first one that felt less like survival and more like authorship. Adrien would arrive exactly as expected and hold attention from the legacy houses. I would arrive impossible to categorize, not comedic buffer, not harmless social glue, not merely donor's son under inquiry, but active petitioner with standing and with enough public momentum after the observatory and forum to make anyone who dismissed me look either careless or scared. Yuna would not enter as observer at all. She would enter through documented academic necessity, as part of the scholarship review file chain. Solène was forcing into banquet procedure, meaning the thing the system had always used to move her quietly in the background, evaluation, would now bring her into the room under official light. That was elegant enough to make me suspicious. Leora would coordinate the internal service pattern and watch for seat swaps, forged escort requests, or donor-side moves toward the archive transfer boxes used for banquet endorsements. Myra, because the universe finally admitted she deserved relevance, would manage external pressure through the student paper and the most efficient gossip web on campus. When Solène finished laying it out, the old fencing room felt too small for the amount of motion waiting in it. No romance confession. No soft violin. No drawn-out monologue about friendship. Just the clean, dangerous feeling of a story, deciding to move around us differently than before. At night, alone in Julian's room with the donor summons still folded on the desk, and my father's shadow not yet gone from the walls, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at the face I had inherited. Warm eyes, easy mouth, built to be trusted, built to be useful, built apparently to stay one step off the center so others could shine without obstruction. I touched the glass. Then I said it out loud, because some decisions only become real once they hear themselves. No more support role. The reflection didn't change. I did. Preparation for the selection banquet did not feel like getting ready for a romance set piece. It felt like weaponizing etiquette. The academy devoted an obscene amount of infrastructure to teaching teenagers how to sit. Politically tailoring session, seating rehearsals, escort protocol, which side of the staircase you enter from if your house can claim military distinction but not treasury leverage, which fork says old money and which spoon says rural nobility trying too hard. My previous life had not equipped me for any of this, but it had equipped me for something adjacent, reading rooms built by people who wanted hierarchy to feel natural. That turned out to be enough. Adrian handled the parts that involved bloodline performance. He corrected my stance twice, my turn timing 4 times, and the angle of my shoulders so often that by the end of the second day I threatened to write his name into a labor complaint just to diversify the paperwork. He told me my shoulders broadcast jokes before my mouth did. I told him his face broadcast constitutional monarchy. Yuna nearly choked on tea trying not to laugh. Small victory. Yuna, meanwhile, trained me in the less obvious battlefield. Banquet records, endorsement language. Donor foundation structures. The exact type of politely lethal question that sounds procedural until a guilty person answers too fast. She was terrifying when fully focused. The comic had always understood that part, but it presented it as charm. It was not charm, it was discipline sharpened under pressure until it could cut lying adults at the joints. Myra handled a different layer entirely. She spread 3 rumors and buried 6, all of them with strategic precision. By the end of the first prep day, the student body broadly believed that Julian Mercer might publicly challenge donor seating irregularities, that Adrian Voss had gone cold enough to freeze a prefect line with one glance, and that Yuna had somehow acquired direct academic protection from the headmistress without sleeping, bribing, or dying. None of those rumors were exactly true. That made them strong. The aura moved through the servant roots and inner administration like someone born under the floorboards. Every evening she brought us practical things that made the academy feel less romantic and more real. Which pantry keys had been copied in secret, which donor lady demanded fresh place cards because she liked watching staff rewrite names under pressure, which balcony curtains hid line of sight over the banquet dais, which old endorsement boxes still had dual locks from before. The board modernized its review procedure. She called this useful truth. I called it horrifying. We were both right. The only thing I had not prepared for was how much the role change hurt emotionally, even while it helped structurally. Once people in the school realized I was not smoothing things anymore, they started revealing exactly what they had always expected from Julian. One debate captain asked whether I could just mediate a donor seat conflict because you're good at making people comfortable. A junior prefect pulled me aside and said it was a shame I had become so intense because everyone used to feel safe round me. One noble girl, smiling beautifully, told me she missed when I laughed more and caused less inconvenience. That one sat with me. Not because she was wrong, because she had described the trap perfectly. Supporting roles are loved most when they absorb friction without changing the room. I went for a walk after that conversation and ended up under the west arch where the roses had started opening early. Yuna found me there because apparently I had become easy to track when angry. She leaned against the stone beside me and waited instead of asking. I appreciated that enough to hate how quickly it softened me. Finally, she said, "You're thinking about whether people only like Julian because he made their live smoother. Very rude of you to know that. I'm efficient." I let the silence sit for a bit. The garden lights were coming on, somewhere near the rehearsal wing. Somebody was practicing violin badly enough to count as violence. Then I said, what if I don't know? Where the line is, between becoming central and just becoming another person who takes too much. Room. Yuna turned her head and looked at me directly, not the comic version of directly, no sparkles, no. Destined framing, just a girl tired enough to tell the truth cleanly. Then learn it while moving, she said. That's still better than staying where someone else placed. You? I laughed under my breath. That sounds like a line people quote over sunsets. It sounds like a thing I learned from you before you started pretending you hadn't changed. That one got me. Because buried under the body swap in the genre and the donor conspiracies, there was a simpler fact. Julian had already been on the edge of this shift. The structure had just made sure he never completed it. The banquet arrived under rain. Of course it did. Romance academies have the same relationship with weather that corrupt institutions have with paper. Trails, they use it whenever possible and pretend it appeared naturally. Carriages rolled through the front court under black umbrellas, lanterns reflected off the stone. The banquet hall glowed through the long windows in gold and white, all candlelight and polished silver and floral. Arrangements expensive enough to fund 3 better scholarship programs. Student musicians tuned strings behind the side screen. Staff moved in calm diagonals. Donors floated in wearing old power and newer perfume. I entered on my father's arm. That was Solen's idea. I hated her for it for a full hour. My father had formally not been cleared, formally not condemned, which meant his appearance under limited donor standing read as both wounded continuity and possible rehabilitation. Exactly the kind of social tension this system loved because it made everyone lean closer. He wore black, looked 10 years older than breakfast in the consultation room, kept his hand steady on my sleeve and his face carefully empty. I did not forgive him on the carriage ride. He did not ask, good, any softer version of the evening would have cheapened it. When our names were announced, the room shifted. You could feel people revising us in real time. Julian Mercer, no longer harmless. Master Mercer, no longer untouchable. Useful. Necessary. Painful. I kept my expression light, because if there is one thing I had learned from inheriting Julian, it was that warmth is still a weapon if you stop letting other people decide where it points. Adrian stood near the central table in formal dark blue with silver trim at the collar, looking exactly like the institution's favorite son, if the institution had accidentally built one with a functioning conscience. His uncle was 3 places down from him, surrounded by the kind of men who always believe they can survive scandal as long as they keep their wine hand steady. Yuna entered 10 minutes later through the academic review line, escorted by Solen's clerk and carrying a sealed document case that made 3 donors visibly uncomfortable. Excellent, Myra from the balcony. Under a student paper press ribbon she had definitely not earned honestly, gave me a microscopic thumbs up behind a floral arrangement, more excellent. The first course was harmless theater, greeting sequences, foundation acknowledgments, headmistress speech about integrity, as if the room had not recently been knee-deep in falsified endorsements. Then came the first turn. Endorsement boxes were brought out. There should have been 4. There were 5. Leora saw it from across the service line first. She did not react with her face. She shifted 1 tray 2 inches left, and that was the signal. 5th box meant shadow endorsements, hidden assignments, emergency substitutions, exactly the kind of thing the Bureau would use if they had already lost the public school battleground and needed one last private redirect. I set my fork down and looked at the extra box. Across the room, Adrian's uncle followed my gaze and smiled. Very small. There it was. Not panic. Counter move. I asked to speak before dessert. That sentence alone caused 3 old women, 2 junior patrons, and 1 donor proxy to flinch in visible class-coded horror, which made me almost happy enough to forget the 5th box. The banquet moderator tried to move on. Solen overruled him with 1 lifted hand. My father did not look at me. Adrian did. Yuna closed her hand once around the seal on the document case and then, when still, the room understood enough to hold its breath. I stood. No dramatic speech prepared in my sleeve, no heroic declaration, just the truth arranged in the order that would make retreat cost the most. I thanked the headmistress for reopening review procedure after the forum. I thanked the student houses for tolerating disruption while evidence was being processed. Then I asked why a donor banquet under active inquiry had introduced a fifth endorsement box unlisted on the seating memorandum and absent from the administrative docket filed that morning. That was not a romantic line. It was better. Half the room did not understand the question. The correct half understood it too well. The moderator began to say there must be some clerical error. Adrian's uncle cut in too fast and said supplementary commendations occasionally required flexible documentation. There it was again. The language of elegant theft, flexible, supplementary, stability, all the same perfume on different rut. I turned toward him and said, "Wonderful, then there will be no issue opening the supplementary box." Before witnesses, you could hear the rain against the windows. You could hear one of the musicians inhale too sharply behind the screen. And then you could hear every person in the room realizing this was no longer a dinner. Adrian's uncle smiled like a man choosing whether civility or speed would serve him better. Lord Mercer, perhaps this is not the proper place for amateur procedural enthusiasm. There are lines so condescending they improve your posture. I smiled back. That would matter more if this room had not spent the last decade pretending. Ceremony was procedure. That got attention from the wrong people, and therefore exactly the right people. So Lynn asked for the box. A service steward moved to retrieve it. The moment his fingers touched the lid, the west side candles went out. Not all the candles, just enough. Half the room in light, half in shadow. A classic little act of controlled confusion, good for theft, panic, or assassination. I was getting very tired of this school's idea of event design. Leora moved first along the service line. Myra shouted from the balcony that nobody should leave their seat because apparently if you cannot stop history, at least narrate it loudly. Adrian was already on his feet. I saw the extra steward nearest the donor dais reach under the tablecloth and knew before he drew it that whatever came next was not about one box anymore. Knife. Not for me. For Yuna. Of course. The whole story had trained itself toward this angle for years. Control the girl, control the center, remove the witness, restore the machine. It was so predictable I nearly hated it more than the danger. I moved before the thought finished. Chair back, table edge, 2 steps through spilled wine and dropped silver. I hit the steward's arm as he rose and the knife skewed wide, carving through embroidered linen instead of scholarship. Flesh. Yuna did not scream. She grabbed the 5th box. Solène barked something in old legal academy language. Adrian went straight for his uncle because men like that never hold the blade themselves, if they can help it, but always know exactly when it is drawn. The room broke hard. Donors stood. Servants dropped trays. One proxy bolted for the side exit and ran directly into 2. City clerk Solène had hidden in the corridor behind the banquet paneling because apparently she had finally decided my style of paranoia had merit. Leora kicked the second false steward in the knee and turned his wrist so cleanly I heard the knife hit stone before half the room had even understood there was a second attacker. Myra from somewhere above the chaos yelled, "Left side. Service curtain," because she had either seen movement or simply believed screaming directions made her important. Both were true. Yuna held the 5th box like it was evidence and a weapon at once. That image fixed the room more than any order did. Scholarship girl in formal dress, rainlight at her back, institution's secret box in her hands. For one impossible second, the story actually looked like it understood itself. Then the curtain on the left side ripped down, and 3 more men came through. Not academy, not donor, not even pretending. Hired hands. At a school banquet. I was past surprised by then. One of them went for the document case on Yuna's chair, another for the side doors, the third for Adrian, which was ambitious and therefore educational. I grabbed the nearest heavy thing, which turned out to be an ornate dessert stand, and introduced it to the first man's shoulder with enough force to ruin a month of pastry planning. He crashed sideways into the central table. Candles hit the cloth. Fire licked up lace like it had been waiting for permission. Somewhere in the middle of that, my father moved. Not elegantly. Not heroically. Just fast. He stepped between the side door attacker and the exit corridor, where the city clerks were trying to get the witnesses through, took a punch badly, and then did the oldest useful thing rich men forget. They still can do. He tackled the man low and hard enough to buy everyone else 3 seconds. That was all we needed. Adrian disarmed the ambitious one. Leora cut the route to the stage. Yuna got the 5th box too. Solène, I dragged a flaming cloth runner off the table and stomped the fire into expensive damp. Surrender while the musicians finally abandoned their instruments and the room gave up on pretending. Anything about the evening could be recovered into grace. The 5th box opened under witness. Inside were sealed reassignment directives. Student placement overrides. Emergency disciplinary conversions. Relationship advisories. Not romance recommendations exactly. Worse, notes on which students should be kept near whom. Separated from whom, observed by whom, quietly encouraged toward what reputation. A social engineering kit disguised as institutional discretion. And on the second stack, under donor seals and coded initials, sat one fresh draft. Julian Mercer, to be publicly commended and privately reassigned to external mentorship rotation. After term, removed from central campus influence. Rewarded out of relevance. Promoted straight back into containment. I stared at it long enough for the room to blur. Then I laughed. I could not help it. Not because it was funny, because it was perfect. The whole title, the whole joke, the machine. Even now, even after observatories and ledgers and ambushes and city clerks, the institution's instinct was still to solve Julian by packaging him as upward motion away from the actual center. Promotion as exile. That was almost art. Everyone heard me laugh. Solène looked at the paper, then at me. Would you care to respond, Mercer? There are questions that are invitations and questions that are tests. That one was both. The banquet hall was half wrecked by then. Smoke, rain at the windows, chairs overturned. 3. Restrained attackers bleeding on expensive carpet. Adrian standing near his uncle with a face that promised winter for generations. Yuna beside Solène holding the open file stack with both hands. Like she had no intention of letting history close it again. Myra white-faced and glowing with vindication from the upper balcony. My father on one knee by the side aisle trying not to show how badly his ribs hurt. And me in the center of all of it. Not off angle. Not smoothing. Not helping the lead arrive. There was no reason left to speak like a side character. So I didn't. I took the reassignment directive from Solène, turned it so the nearest donors could see the seal, and said, clearly enough for every table and every witness, and every frightened servant and every panicking patron to hear, this school has spent years deciding who gets to become a person in public and who gets to become support structure in private. It dressed that decision as tradition. Mentorship, discipline, and care. It used scholarships as leverage, prefect offices as filters, donor money as editing tools, and students as movable pieces. And every time someone became too visible in the wrong direction, it called the correction stability. No one interrupted. Good. I held up the paper. This is what stability looks like when you finally print it honestly, not education, not guidance. Containment with better calligraphy. The rain hit the windows harder. I went on. If this academy wants to keep pretending it trains future leaders, then it can start by explaining why it needed secret files to make sure some of us stayed useful, likable, and permanently secondary. And there it was. Not confession. Not romantic climax. Not chosen one awakening. A direct accusation against narrative hierarchy itself, made inside a room built to preserve it. For once, the story did not know where to cut away. The aftermath took 3 days, 6 committees, 12 witness statements, 1 city injunction, and more donors screaming than I thought the human throat could sustain without formal training. None of that mattered as much as the first 20 minutes after the speech. Because after the words landed, the room had to choose a direction. That is what I had finally learned. Institutions survive not by never being exposed, but by forcing exposure to move sideways into confusion before it becomes alignment. The banquet had been built to absorb scandal and still serve dessert. My job had been to make that impossible. The moment I said containment with better calligraphy, I saw half the student attendees stop being audience and become Witnesses? You can feel a room reclassify itself if you pay attention. It is one of the most useful things I know. Adrian moved next. Not to defend me. To close the angle. He took the stack from Yuna, pulled 3 of the clearest reassignment directives free, and placed them face up on the nearest intact donor table beside the house seal. No speech, no dramatic look. Just evidence in expensive light. That was his gift, making authority confront what it wanted to. Blur. Yuna followed by naming names. Scholarship removals. Donor interventions. Committee diversions. Not all of them. Enough. Enough that every student in the room could suddenly locate themselves inside the machine. Enough that anyone who tried to dismiss the Bureau as a clerical excess now had to answer for actual harm. Myra, magnificent opportunist that she was, sent 3 runner notes out through the student paper channels before anyone could stop her. By the time the first formal lockdown order hit the residence halls, half the academy already knew the banquet had exploded and why. That saved us. Not morally, practically. Once too many people know the shape of a lie, administration can still delay, but it cannot edit cleanly. Solène closed the hall under civic witness authority. City clerk sealed the 5th box. Adrian's uncle was detained. Not arrested, not yet, but restricted hard enough that his silence finally looked less like confidence and more like damage control. My father was taken to the infirmary under watch. Because of the ribs and because Solène, for all her cruelty, preferred compromised donors alive for questioning. Leora vanished into internal security work so fast she might as well have been a rumor. Again, Yuna and I gave statements until my mouth felt made of chalk. Adrian gave one that was so precise I briefly considered whether being in love with him in any timeline would just mean losing arguments on religious grounds. Then, because the world enjoys layered humiliation, I went back to Julian's room near dawn and found a formal note waiting on the desk. Pending inquiry, all private donor privileges associated with Mercer student accommodations were suspended, meaning the townhouse was gone. I read the note twice. Then I laughed again, softer this time. Because, of course, the system had finally failed to push me out of the center, so now it was taking my furniture. Myra came by an hour later, took one look at my face and said, "Tell me before I start punching." Architecture. I handed her the note. She read it, rolled her eyes so hard I felt bad for the muscles and said, "Good, the dorms are funnier." I did not know whether to appreciate or resent how quickly she adjusted to catastrophe. Probably both. By noon I was in a dorm room across the hall from Adrian. Not because of romance. Because Solène said she trusted Voss's corridor more than she trusted donor housing under active inquiry, and because apparently once you start exposing the administrative skeleton of an elite academy, privacy becomes a negotiable luxury. The room itself was small by Julian's previous standards, and still larger than anything I had ever had in my first life. Narrow bed, tall windows, 1 desk, 1 shelf, 1 wardrobe, old stone under the rug. It smelled like ink and cold air and somebody else's tea from years before. I stood in the middle of it with 2 borrowed trunks and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not for the scandal, not for the fight. For the size. Small rooms tell the truth better. No social choreography, no donor polish, no sidehouse velvet, just a bed, a desk, and whether you can live honestly between them. Adrian helped move the 2nd trunk without commenting on the downgrade. That was another thing he did well, leaving dignity intact by pretending it had never been in danger. When he set the trunk down, he looked at the room, then at me and said, "You smile more honestly in spaces that can't perform status." I stared at him. That is an offensive amount of perception for one person. He almost smiled. "You've been a disruptive influence." That sounds like a medal. Don't get used to praise. Too late, I'm building furniture from it. That got the smallest real laugh out of him yet. No witnesses, no audience, no strategic value. Which made it possibly the most dangerous sound I had heard all term. Yuna arrived later with copied case summaries, 2 sharpened pencils, and a list of students potentially harmed by Bureau reassignment, who wanted to give testimony if somebody organized the process without letting it become another elite performance. That was how the next stage started. Not with rest, with work. And this is the part the old story would probably have skipped. Not because it didn't matter, because repair is harder to romanticize than collapse. We built a witness structure. Myra handled student routing, because she could separate gossip from fear in under 2 minutes. Yuna created clean intake categories, so scholarship students could speak without having to decode. Noble vocabulary first. Adrien leveraged prefect procedure to preserve the testimonies inside formal disciplinary channels, before the donor board could strip the process back to review. I handled the middle. Of course I did. Because even after everything, I was still the one people told difficult things to first. The difference was that now I understood what that position was worth. Not less than lead. Just a different kind of center if you stop handing its power away for free. By the second evening in the dorms, my desk was full of names, students whose club paths had been blocked because a donor child wanted the role, scholarship girls rerouted into service tasks right before ranking season, heirs quietly encouraged away from each other because of future political alliance required cleaner social optics. Julian's brother's case was in there too, half-buried under older administrative language, designed to make trauma sound like an unfortunate temperament. Spiral, I read that file alone. I wish I had not. The Bureau had not just kept Julian soft. It had broken one brother first, and then sold the second as a safer investment. That was the night my father wrote asking to see me. I did not answer until morning. We met in the lower conservatory under watch, because Solène considered private family. Reconciliation too close to evidence tampering for comfort. Again, fair. He looked tired in a way. Money can't sand down, not destroyed, just finally introduced to consequence without insulation. He did not open with apology. Good. He had lost the right to easy versions. He asked about the dorm room first. I told him the bed squeaked and the desk was honest. He nodded like that hurt. Then he said he had read the initial inquiry findings on my brother's case. Not all of them, Solène had not been that generous. Enough to understand that what he paid for later had been built out of the same people who mishandled the first collapse. Enough to understand he had bought his fear from the men who caused it. I wanted to say yes. That is what I have been trying to explain about systems since I had a mortgage. In a different universe. Instead I said, you wanted to keep Julian from becoming Central because Central had already taken one son from you. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Yes. And you never asked whether being made secondary might take him too. That landed. He looked older after it. I thought surviving with less would still be surviving, he said. I believed him. That was the hard part. Belief is not absolution. Sometimes it just makes the shape of the damage sadder. So I told him the only answer I had. Maybe that was true once, it isn't true anymore. He nodded once, asked if there was anything he could do now. I almost laughed because parents always ask that after the architecture is already on fire, but then I thought about witness chains, donor logs, signature roots. The house is still pretending this could be contained as a prefectural excess. There is, I said. Tell the full truth publicly before someone offers you a quieter version. That was not mercy either. It was utility with a little dignity left inside it. He agreed. And when he left, I realized I no longer needed his approval enough for it to rearrange my spine. That was probably the actual promotion. Everything after that moved toward spring. Not back toward the original romance line, toward something stranger and better. The school had lost its ability to quietly sort people into central and peripheral outcomes, not entirely, institutions. Do not shed habits in one season, but the machine had cracked open enough that everyone could hear it now, which meant every future scene would happen in a place where the walls themselves had been forced to witness. On the first clear morning after the inquiry hearings began, I crossed the courtyard carrying 3 testimony folders, 1 cup of terrible dorm coffee, and a pencil behind my ear because apparently I had become the kind of person who weaponized stationery under pressure. Yuna met me by the fountain with new intake sheets. Adrian came down the west steps with revised prefect rosters and the expression of a man already anticipating 6 forms of resistance before breakfast. Myra was halfway over the rail of the lower terrace because she had heard a rumor before the rumor knew itself. Liara. Watch from the administration side corridor, hands behind her back, knife probably still in the boot because some reforms need practical backups. For one suspended second, with everyone in motion toward the same center, I saw the whole thing. Clearly. Not the love triangle. Not the shipping wars. Not who readers wanted to kiss under flowering trees. The actual shape of the story. A school built to decide who got to matter. A system built to keep some people useful and others luminous. A side character who finally noticed the architecture and decided he hated the assignment more than he feared the spotlight. That was enough. Maybe not to become the male lead in the neat original sense, but enough to ruin the old guide and start writing a better one. I looked at the three of them, at the folders in my arms, at the courtyard that had stopped feeling like a set and started feeling like contested ground, and thought something so simple it almost embarrassed me. I was here on purpose now. And Myra shouted that the donor review board had arrived early, and somebody in navy silk was already crying near the administrative wing, which meant the day had finally started. Perfect. The donor review board arrived with umbrellas, legal folders, and the kind of faces people wear when they plan to describe a disaster as an unfortunate process misunderstanding. 3 senior donors, 1 city education representative, 2 academy governors, and Chairwoman Vale herself. I recognized her immediately, even though the comic had only ever drawn her from expensive angles. She was Yuna's and on paper, guardian by finance, trustee by social leverage, and the kind of woman who could turn care into custody without raising her voice. She stepped into the administrative wing as if weather, panic, and witnesses were all mild inconveniences somebody else had failed to remove in time. The worst part was how calm she looked when she saw me. Not shocked, not irritated, calm. That meant she had already adjusted to Julian Mercer becoming difficult, which meant the next trap had already been designed with the new version of me in mind. The board's first move was procedural containment, freeze the inquiry timeline, restrict student testimony to closed review, reclassify all donor-linked files as privileged under family reputation protection. I know that sounds fake. It wasn't. Institutions with enough money will always eventually invent a way to treat embarrassment like a privacy right. So Len fought every clause in person. Adrian built case chains around internal prefect violations. Yuna reorganized scholarship witness statements so quickly the clerk started deferring to her by instinct. I handled the ugly middle again, which meant translating what the board was trying to do into student language fast enough that nobody got softened by vocabulary. Myra turned that into fire. I lunched. The student paper had run a special circular titled, "Who Gets Protected When Records Go Missing?" Anonymous byline. Obviously hers. It didn't accuse directly. It didn't need to. It laid out pattern, consequence, and questioning clean columns. Which students got reassigned, which houses benefited, which scholarship appeals vanished after donor intervention, which prefects kept surviving scandal like old cats. Students started pinning copied sheets to the west corridor. Notice boards faster than faculty could take them down. Someone chalked supporting cast no more. Across the lower court stones before dawn patrol scrubbed it away. Someone else painted the box had 5 seals on the retaining wall by the carriage lane. The school was finally acting like it had read itself. The board hated that. By evening they switched tactics. The new line was not that nothing had happened. Too late. The new line was that outside agitation, student emotional instability, and unauthorized access had contaminated valid institutional review. In other words, the truth might exist, but children had touched it, so adults should be allowed to bury it more professionally. I wish that were an exaggeration. It was. The first direct hit landed through Yuna. Again, because institutions are boring when afraid. A notice was posted ordering immediate review of her scholarship conduct due to improper handling of restricted documentation and disruptive influence on academic cohesion. That phrase alone almost made me eat the paper. Academic cohesion. She had found the rot, and their answer was to accuse her of making the school look untidy while bleeding. I got the notice from a terrified bursar clerk who slipped it under my dorm door because apparently being central now also meant people started bringing me explosives wrapped in stationery. Yuna read the order in the lower study room, while Rain tapped the windows and 30 students pretended not to watch us. Her face did the thing I hated most, went still enough that I knew the hurt had gone deeper than anger. They're not even trying to hide it, she said. No, I answered, they're trying to normalize it. Adrian took the paper from her, read the charge line twice and said, then we stop letting them define the room. That sounds like a line readers would clip. In person it meant work. Leora came to us just after dark with 3 ugly facts. 1. The review board intended to move Yuna's hearing to the old Senate chamber, which had no student gallery and 2 donor-controlled side exits. 2. Marius had started naming names in exchange for reduced consequences, but only after redacting everyone above the board liaison tier. 3. Chairwoman Vale had requested a private family meeting with Yuna before the hearing. I asked whether that meant threat, guilt, or grooming. Leora said yes. I was starting to resent how often that was the correct answer in this school. We refused the private meeting. Chairwoman Vale sent flowers anyway. Yuna threw them into the sink. That might still be my favorite act of class warfare in the whole file. The hearing itself was designed to shrink her. That was obvious the second we entered the old Senate chamber. Long table, raised observer dais, tight witness box, heavy curtains, no student seating except 6 standing places against the side wall by special allowance, which is how institutions say you may watch your own erasure if you remain grateful about it. Adrian was there as prefect witness. Myra got in because she forged a paper press ribbon that looked slightly too official to challenge without paperwork. Leora got in because nobody had yet found a safe way to tell her no. I got in because Solène overrode the donor seat list personally and said if the board wanted Julian Mercer out of the room, they were welcome to try saying so on record. Chairwoman Vale sat 3 places in from the center. When Yuna took the witness position, the chairwoman looked at her the way some relatives look at children who have become expensive in public, not hatred, ownership made inconvenient. The board council opened with ritual language about preserving educational integrity. Then he started asking questions designed to sound neutral, while framing Yuna as emotionally overinvested, socially unstable, and academically compromised by attachment to specific student factions. It was vicious in the exact way good institutions prefer. No direct insult, just enough implication to let prejudice finish the work. Yuna answered every question cleanly. That was their problem. They had built the room to make her small and discovered she did not fit that size anymore. Then the council made his mistake. He asked whether her closeness with certain male students might have influenced her interpretation of otherwise ordinary administrative irregularities. There are dozens of ways to describe that line: misogynistic, strategic, predictable, cowardly. None of them fully capture how much the room changed when it landed. Adrian's hand tightened once on the witness rail. Myra made a sound so obscene she probably discovered a new category of contempt. I stood up before I had permission, because some things only deserve interruption. Are you asking whether she found corruption, I said, or whether it would be more comfortable for everyone here if she had been prettier and quieter while doing it? The chamber stopped breathing. The board council turned toward me with open anger. Mercer, you are out of order. I know it's my best subject. Sit down. No. Chairwoman Vale finally spoke. Julian. Just my name, no title, no softness, which told me she had moved me out of harmlessness in her own mind already useful. I looked straight at her and said, if the board wants to claim this is a procedural hearing, then maybe stop asking questions built to turn her testimony into gossip. That got me formally warned, which was worth it. More important, it forced Solène to comment for the record that scholarship integrity review should concern documentation, not insinuation. The city education representative, who had so far been trying very hard to behave like wallpaper, finally asked the board council to restate his line of inquiry more narrowly. He could not do it without exposing what he was doing. The room slipped. Tiny shift. Enough. That was when Myra dropped the second bomb. She stood from the side wall and requested observer privilege to submit a student press packet documenting 14 additional cases where female scholarship students had been socially Discredited before committee review. She had no standing to do that. That was the beauty of it. The board could reject her, but rejecting her after I had just forced the misogyny into the open would make them look exactly like what they were, so they had to take the packet, which meant the packet entered the room, which meant the room changed from one girl on trial to a pattern. Chairwoman Vale's face did not move. Her hand did. One finger once against the table. I only noticed because by then I was watching hands more than statements. A signal. Leora saw it too. She turned her head slightly toward the side entrance. And I knew before anybody moved that the real attack had just shifted elsewhere. The student archive room was on fire. Not metaphorically. Actually on fire. By the time the message runner reached the Senate chamber doors and stammered out the words, everybody in the room already knew the timing was impossible. That was what made it credible. You do not build synchronized accidents during hearings unless you assume everyone else still believes in. Coincidence? The board had just made its biggest error. It acted like we were still living inside the old machine. We were. So Len moved first. She adjourned the hearing on the spot and ordered fire containment, archive protection, and witness hold under civic seal before the board could reframe any of it. Adrian was already out the side door before the sentence ended. I followed. Yuna and Leora came with us. Myra came because nobody in this story had yet managed to define a crisis she wouldn't sprint toward. The archive wing stank of smoke by the time we hit the lower stair. Not a full building fire, controlled burn, fast-setting oil on door frames and document crates near the intake shelf, meant to destroy selected records while leaving enough of the room intact for people to call it sabotage by frightened students or anti-donor radicals. Again, boring evil. The worst kind. 2 academy porters were trying to get a hose line connected. One was crying, the other was swearing. At the valve, Adrian kicked the side latch off the archive door before I even reached it. Heat rolled out hard enough to blister the air in my nose. Not big fire, nasty fire, focused, shelves on the right side already burning up through the index drawers, floor papers lifting and blackening like dead moths. Yuna went straight for the left stack, where the scholarship reviews were held. I grabbed her wrist before she crossed the threshold. Not because she couldn't judge danger. Because the ceiling beam over that side was already cracking at the joint. She looked back at me furious enough to burn separately. Let go. Left beam, I said. She looked up, then swore creatively and changed direction without wasting the second. That is what I love most about competent people. Once they see the truth, they don't perform pride about it. We moved as a unit after that. Adrian and I dragged the metal index cart clear so the porters could get line pressure inside. Yuna cleared the priority boxes from the lower review shelf. Myra, who had absolutely no reason to know how archives were arranged, started throwing donor ledgers into laundry sacks because apparently her prep for student journalism had included burglary fantasies, and she was finally getting field credit. Leora vanished deeper into the smoke than any sane person would and came back with the registry key, ring in one hand and blood on the other that, thankfully, was not hers. Then I saw the real target. Not the donor boxes. Not the scholarship files. The witness log. The one Solène had started after the forum. The one with names, access times, statements, and intake sequence. Burn that and everything later gets harder to prove cleanly. It was on the high side shelf under the heating vent, exactly where someone with insider building knowledge would place a directional burn to make it look incidental. I climbed the side ladder before thinking, because at this point, thinking had become a luxury activity. The smoke hit harder up high. My eyes started watering immediately. I could hear Adrian yelling something below, hear Yuna coughing, hear the hose finally catch and slap water against the nearest shelf, and still none of it mattered more than the blackening edge of the witness ledger 2 feet. From my hand, I lunged for it. The ladder shifted. For half a second, I knew exactly how stupid the image would look from the floor. The side character literally climbing into a fire for documentation. My roommate would have called it symbolic and then sent a crying sticker. I got the ledger. The top shelf collapsed at the same time, would hit my shoulder, heat bit through my sleeve. The ladder went sideways and I came down hard with the book. Against my chest, an arc of ash in my mouth. Adrian hauled me clear before I could decide whether my legs still belonged to me. We stumbled out into the hall as the porters and 2 arriving faculty pushed the hose line fully. Through the door, the left side shelves were saved, the right side was ruined, controlled damage. Surgical enough to prove intent if anybody cared to count burn pattern and fuel line. Luckily, then we did care. I handed the witness ledger to Yuna. She held it like something alive. Her eyes moved to my sleeve. Burn line not deep, ugly enough, you're bleeding. So is the archive, I said. Myra leaned against the corridor wall black with soot and said, I'm starting to think the donors are taking this personally. That would have been funny if Chairwoman Vale had not reached the hall at exactly that moment. Not running, not breathless, calm again, too calm. She took in the smoke, the hose line, the recovered sacks, the witness ledger in Yuna's hands, my half-burned sleeve, Adrian's expression, and then said the line that finally made me hate her cleanly. This is why emotional escalation makes orderly review impossible. I think everybody in the hallway stopped believing civility was a moral good at the same time. Yuna stepped forward before anyone else, soot on her cheek, hair half fallen loose, witness ledger held against her ribs. Orderly review, she said. Somebody tried to burn student testimony during a hearing built to discredit me. Chairwoman Vale did not blink, and if you had allowed the board to do its work instead of turning every stage into spectacle, perhaps frightened people would not have acted rashly. There are lies, and then there are statements so structurally poisonous they reveal the whole architecture at once. Adrian's voice came out like cut glass. Frightened people with access to secured archive fuel. That was the line that should have ended it. Instead, Chairwoman Vale looked at him, then at Yuna, then at me and said, You 3 have mistaken. Disruption for leadership. Wrong move. Not because the sentence was untrue in a dramatic sense, because it misunderstood the stage. People had gathered in the corridor by then. Porters, students, 2 masters, 3 clerks, 1 city investigator, Myra still smudged with soot, Leora with blood drying dark on one cuff. This was no longer a private institutional correction. This was a public room. So I answered her in one. Maybe, I said, but your side has mistaken management for morality for years. Nobody breathed. The city investigator, who had spent most of the week trying not to become the main character in an Academy scandal, finally stepped in and asked for all donor board members to remain on site under inquiry restriction until the archive fire pattern was examined. Chairwoman Vale turned to him with polished outrage. He did not fold. Good. Maybe civic function had one working joint left after all. She left under escort. Not dragged, not shamed, not yet. But for the first time since this whole thing started, she left a room without choosing the final language used inside it, which meant the tide was finally moving in a direction even old money had to feel. That night the witness log slept under Solen's personal seal in a locked office. That night the student body stopped treating the scandal like a spectacular rumor and started treating it like a school war. And that night, while I sat on the floor of my dorm room with a bandage wrapped from wrist to elbow, and ash still in my hair, Myra came in without knocking, threw a folded flyer onto my bed and said, Congratulations, somebody just made you impossible to contain. The flyer was handwritten, copied, and already spreading through the residence halls. No more quiet corrections. Open assembly at Spring Court. Students present. FILES present. Witnesses present. No closed doors. At the bottom, somebody had drawn a tiny crown with a line through it. I laughed until my bandaged arm hurt. Then I realized what the flyer meant. The school had taken the story back from the board. Not all the way. Enough. And once students start claiming the stage for themselves, even the richest scripts begin to shake. The open assembly was 3 days away. That was not enough time. It was perfect. Long enough for panic to spread. Short enough that the board couldn't quietly rearrange the whole school before witnesses hardened into momentum. Everybody chose a side in those 3 days, including the people who pretended not to choose. That was the strange clarity of it. You didn't need declarations. You could read it in corridors. Which tables filled first, which faculty suddenly remembered meetings elsewhere when scholarship students approached, which donor children laughed too loudly and watched too carefully, which prefects kept their badges, and which started pinning them on with hands that looked less certain than before. I spent the first day in motion. Not because that was wise. Because stillness was impossible. 1 hour with Solène mapping witness order. 1 in the library annex helping Yuna sort statements. By category so the assembly wouldn't drown in raw pain without structure. 1 in the dorm corridor. With Myra and the student paper line, separating rumors worth amplifying from traps designed to split the coalition. 1 in the infirmary because the archive burn had gotten angrier overnight, and the nurse insisted I was not allowed to turn pain into personality just because the school had finally become interesting. The only person who seemed to move less and matter more was Adrian. He had entered some sharper mode that made even his silences feel administrative. Prefect rosters were rewritten, patrol lines shifted, outer access to the old Senate wing sealed under civic review. 3 prefect aides resigned publicly, and 2 more begged to give statements before they were named by others. At one point I watched him stand in the center of the East Hall and tell 4 donor sons that their house standing did not outrank investigation protocol, and for the first time I understood why the story had built so much gravity around him. Not beauty, not pain, reliability. Under pressure, readers turn that into romance because they're cowards about how much they love competence. Yuna noticed I was watching and said, "Try not to look impressed, he feeds on it." "I'm studying enemy biology." "Liar." "Rude." She smiled without lifting her head from the testimony index. That was happening more often now, and each time it felt less like a genre trap and more like whether finally learning the room. By the second day, the board tried a new angle. They announced that the spring assembly would still occur, but under revised dignity protocols. No unsanctioned materials, no independent witness packets, student commentary restricted to approved petition windows. In other words, they wanted the optics of openness without the risk of actual speech. Solène tore that announcement apart in front of the civic clerk so thoroughly the man forgot to blink for half the exchange. But the move served its purpose anyway. It reminded us that the board still controlled rituals, and rituals are where old power hides its last decent knives. That was when Myra said the smartest thing of the week. "Then stop playing by assembly logic." We all looked at her. She shrugged and tore a sugar packet open with her teeth. "Seriously, they know how to survive speeches, they know how to survive formal accusations, they know how to survive procedure long enough to turn it into old people weather. So why are we building toward their arena like obedient extras?" Noah, who had been half appearing and half vanishing through this whole arc as our unofficial records, Ghost actually laughed through his tea. "Do you have an illegal suggestion?" "Several," she said. "Pick one." That was how the final plan changed. The open assembly would still happen. It just would not be the real center anymore. The real center would be the founder court. The old circular space in the middle of the 4 wings where first-year induction, donor blessing, scholarship oath, and leadership presentation all crossed in the academy's symbolic architecture. Big enough for the whole student body, public enough to make every interruption visible, wired. Thanks to the spring season pageant, with display glass and projection lines for founder history. Exhibits, which meant if Noah was as good as he kept implying he was and if the maintenance keys Leora had quietly copied were real, the whole court could become a live document stage the board did not fully control. The second I understood it, I grinned. Yuna saw the grin and said, "That is the face you make before property damage." "No." She waited. I reconsidered. "Not necessarily." Adrian, who had been listening from the window with his arms crossed and his face doing the deep internal suffering of a man asked to become more theatrical in public, finally said, "If we move the center, they will try to stop the transition before enough witnesses gather." "Good," Myra said. "Let them look scared in the open." That line became the whole method. Do not let them quietly refuse. Make them publicly flinch. We broke the plan into layers. The formal assembly would draw the board, faculty, and donor observers into the Senate Hall as expected. Meanwhile, student runners would redirect the actual body of the school toward founder court under the pretext of a records clarification notice tied to the witness log. That part needed to sound boring enough for authority to underestimate it, and serious enough for students to move quickly. Noah drafted the wording, Myra gave it enough gossip texture to travel, Leora arranged the maintenance access to the projection line under the founder exhibit, Yuna chose the documents, not all of them the cleanest ones, the ones that showed pattern without depending on sentiment. Adrian handled the timing at the hall itself, which mostly meant deciding the exact second to become impossible in front of the board. I got the part nobody else wanted, and therefore probably fit me best. I had to speak twice. Once in the assembly hall to stall, redirect, and make the board commit to a position. Then again in founder court, not as a joke, not as a supportive witness, but as the person visibly naming the architecture to the entire school in one shot before they could smother it in formal language that terrified me in a quieter, more honest way than monsters or knives ever had. Not because of stage fright. Because speaking in public as the center meant there would be no safe version of Julian left to retreat into afterward. I said yes anyway. The night before the assembly, I could not sleep, so I went to the roof over the west dorm because all transitional emotional crises in this school apparently required elevation and weather. Adrian found me there without surprise. He stood beside the parapet for a while without speaking, which I appreciated more than conversation. Finally, he said, "You know this will not end with a clean victory. Have you met my life?" "Unfortunately." I laughed under my breath. Then he added, "After tomorrow, they will not be able to make you peripheral again. Even if the board loses, even if the school changes, that part will stay. There are people who tell you the truth gently, and people who tell you the truth in the exact shape needed to hold your spine up." Adrian was the second kind. I looked out over the dark court, the wet stone, the founder banners tied ready for the spring assembly, and said, "Good." He turned just enough that I caught the profile. "Good. I'm tired of being easy to place." He did not answer for a second. Then he said, "So am I." That startled me more than it should have. Because for all the story framed him as the male lead, Adrian had also been placed, groomed into distance, built into the correct symbolic center, loved in the narrowest acceptable direction. Watching him realize that out loud felt more intimate than anything the comic had ever done with. Blushing, we stood there a little longer. No grand confession. No nearly touching hands. Just rain smell, dark roofs, and the knowledge that tomorrow was going to cut everybody's assigned roll open in public. When I finally went downstairs, Yuna was asleep at my desk with 2 testimony packets under one hand and a pencil line across her wrist. Myra had apparently left a note on the pillow that said, "If you die tomorrow, I will edit your legacy for humor." Leora's copied key sat beside the lamp. Noah's final projection sequence was tucked under the water glass in tiny, terrifying script. All the people who had helped build the next day were present in the room, one way or another. That mattered. Because the promotion, I had finally realized, was never about replacing the male lead. It was about refusing to let any one person carry the whole shape of the story alone, while everyone else bled in the margins. Once I understood that, speaking at the center felt less like theft and more like responsibility. I slept for maybe 2 hours. It was enough. Morning came with bells, wet stone, white banners, and the kind of tension that makes even the birds sound opinionated. The spring assembly had started. If you have never seen an elite academy try to preserve dignity while the floor is actively leaving under its shoes, I recommend it as a hobby. The Senate Hall was full before the third bell. Board at the front, donors in the side gallery, faculty arranged in supposedly neutral order. Students packed by house rows under the oversight of prefects, who were by then divided cleanly into 3 categories: loyal to the board, loyal to the headmistress, or loyal to their own survival. Solène opened the session with the standard spring line about renewal and accountability, which almost made me laugh because neither word had ever been under this much strain inside these walls. Then the board representative stood to reassert revised assembly protocol. Too soon. Too eager. Adrian moved before he finished the second sentence. Not dramatically. That was the best part. He simply stood and requested procedural clarification on whether revised protocol had been filed before or after the civic inquiry seal on witness handling. Boring question, deadly timing, because the answer was after, which meant the board had either ignored the seal or tried to override it. The representative knew that, Solène knew that, the city clerk at the side table definitely knew that. The room did not know all the law, but it knew enough to smell blood once adults started correcting each other with paper in hand. The representative tried to redirect. Adrian did not sit down. That was the key. He stayed standing long enough for every student to understand that the fight had started in earnest. Then Yuna rose from the witness row and requested the right to submit student testimony on assembly. Governance integrity before spring endorsements were recognized, not scholarship integrity, not her. Case governance, broader frame, stronger blade. The board denied the request exactly the way we wanted them to, too fast, too publicly, and with enough contempt that the student body reacted before faculty could flatten it. Noise hit the room in waves. Myra, from the third student row, shouted that if governance integrity could not survive testimony, then maybe the endorsements were decorative. 3 students laughed. 12 more started talking at once. A prefect on the donor side tried to restore order. Leora, posted behind the witness line under official security transfer, asked him by what authority. He did not answer cleanly. And that was the opening. I stood. No request. No permission. I stood in the center aisle under 4 generations of institutional portraiture and said, if the assembly is too small to hold the school's own records, let's stop pretending it is the center. Everything paused. There are lines you feel leave your life and become architecture the second they hit public air. That was one. The board representative demanded I sit. Solène did not. Another tiny shift. I turned not to the board but to the students behind me. That was deliberate. The old system always made speech flow upward first. Petition the front, perform for power, translate yourself into something the center could digest. I was done doing that. The witness files are sealed, I said. The archive records are real. The donor override chain is real. The reassignment directives are real. If this hall can't bear open review, founder court can. For half a beat, no one moved. Then Myra stood on her bench and yelled, Founder court. It should have been ridiculous. Instead, it was perfect. Students started rising in sections before the board even finished objecting. Not all of them. Enough to transform atmosphere into movement. You cannot stop a school once it decides a room no longer contains the truth. The back rows went first, scholarship section, lower house rows. Debate club because they would follow conflict into water if it promised rhetoric. Then the middle benches. Then students whose families had no donor protection left to spend pretending neutrality. Was elegant. The whole hall did not explode, it shifted, which is harder to control. The board tried to adjourn. Solène said, very clearly, that the spring assembly would reconvene in founder court under public witness due to procedural trust failure in the Senate hall. That sentence alone probably shortened. 3 donor lives by stress. Adrian moved to the main doors and held them open. That image is going to live in my head for years. The male lead, immaculate in spring uniform, holding the hall open not for the center but for the transfer of the center. Readers would have died. I almost did, but for different reasons. We moved fast after that. Noah already had the projection sequence primed in the founder court maintenance channel. Leora split the security line before anyone on the donor side fully understood where the real contest had gone. Yuna carried the witness log and the selected files. I took the index packet and the reassignment directive they drafted for Julian, because if I was going to drag the machine into open light, I wanted its prettiest lie in my own hand. Founder court was already filling by the time we broke into the air. Rain had stopped, good. Wet stone still held light in patches from the morning, the old founder. Glass at the center display dais had been covered for the spring pageant. Noah, bless his criminal soul, had already rerouted the display lanterns into the archive projection frame. The first image hit the glass before half the teachers reached the court. Rows of names. Not the whole file. The clean list. Students reassigned by donor intervention. House term reason code, hidden directive. You could hear the crowd read. There is a sound for that, not silence, a shifting intake like a Room learning its own language too fast. Then came the second slide. Scholarship restrictions by social proximity. The third, prefect intervention notes. The fourth, relationship advisories. By that point, the board had reached the outer ring and was shouting over a display nobody could unsee too late. Once the words are on glass in front of the whole school, procedure becomes archaeology. I climbed the founder dais because somebody had to. Because if I had forced this shift and then hidden behind the projection, I would have been doing the same thing the old Julian was always made to do, move the scene without taking the cost of it. Openly. So I climbed. The court fell quieter than I expected. Not respectful. Alert. Good enough. I looked out over students, masters, prefects, donors, city clerks, one apocalyptic amount of administrative panic, and thought absurdly of my first life, corporate meeting rooms, stolen slides, quiet endurance sold as professionalism. Then I looked at the reassignment directive in my hand and finally understood the through line. Different building, same machine. So I said it. All of it. Not every detail of the bureau, not every donor route, just the core. This school has spent years deciding who gets to stand at the center and who gets shaped around them. Nobody laughed. Good. It called that guidance, stability, tradition. It called some students promising and others distracting, some necessary and others excessive. It rewarded people for fitting the role already designed for them and corrected anyone who started becoming visible in the wrong direction. I held up the directive. This was written for me after the banquet. Commendation, transfer, external mentorship. Nice words. Pretty seal. The real goal was simple. Remove me from the center of the school politely, because once I stopped being harmless, I became inconvenient. The line landed harder than I expected, because by then everybody knew me enough for the sentence to map. Then I looked at Yuna. At the same time, they use scholarship review and reputation pressure to keep students like Belle under supervision, always visible enough to be useful, never safe enough to speak without cost. Then Adrian. And they used house legacy to train students like Voss into carrying the institution's public weight while other people edited the stage under him. No flourish. No romance triangle spin. The structure named to the faces inside it. That was what the old system had never prepared for. Not exposure, interpretation. It knew how to survive scandal by narrowing it into personal failure. What it could not survive as easily was the whole school seeing pattern at once. The board representative tried to seize the court on grounds of unlawful disclosure. Myra shouted from the lower steps, then sue the projector. Someone laughed. Then 20 people did. That mattered more than it should have. Because once power loses control of tone, it starts losing control of sequence. Yuna took the dais beside me after that, not behind. Good. She named the scholarship cases and refused the board's attempt to fold them back into exceptional circumstance. Adrian came up last and formally placed his prefect's seal under the city clerk's interim witness order, which meant the student enforcement arm of the academy was now split in public view between board-loyal process and inquiry-loyal legitimacy. The effect on the crowd was immediate. A dozen prefects on the outer ring stepped toward us, not them. That was the end, not the speech, not the documents, the shift in bodies. People choose stories with their feet before they choose them with their mouths. Chairwoman Vale tried once to reclaim the center. She stepped forward, lifted her chin, and said the school was being manipulated by theatrical children who mistook visibility for governance. I should thank her honestly, because she gave me the final line. No, I said, you mistook our silence for consent. That was it. Nothing prettier would have helped. The city education representative asked for immediate suspension of donor board authority over student placement pending state review. Solène seconded it under emergency academic integrity statute. The clerks wrote. The crowd heard it. The board finally understood it was no longer negotiating optics but surviving witness. And just like that, the old machine lost the room. The formal collapse still took time. Machines do not stop because the room changes. They stop because enough hands enter them with the right tools and enough witnesses stay long enough to make quiet repair impossible. The inquiry stretched into late spring. Donor houses fought. 3 masters resigned before they could be asked harder questions. Adrian's uncle lost committee standing and tried to leave the city. Under medical leave before the civic seal caught him at the station, Marius named the bureau liaison. Network fully once he understood nobody was coming to save his dignity. Chairwoman Vale did not go down easily, which made sense. Women like her do not build social custody structures around schools. Because they frighten easily, she fought through law, family pressure, and reputation leverage, but even she could not survive the witness architecture once student testimony, original ledgers, and donor routing matched too cleanly in public. Julian's brother's file was reopened. That mattered to me more than the donors falling. My father submitted a full statement before he was compelled to, not out of pure morality, I think. Out of the late, ugly realization that if he let other men narrate his fear, they would bury both his sons differently and call it stewardship. We did not become close after that. This is not that kind of story, but he stopped trying to buy safety in secret and started answering questions where people could hear him. Sometimes that is the closest damaged adults get to love. The school changed too. Slowly, badly, realistically. There was no perfect reform montage. There were forms, review committees, witness fatigue, students who wanted change until change required paperwork and then remembered they were 19. But there were also real things. The Scholarship Advisory Office was removed from donor influence. Prefect review authority became traceable. Student placement records were indexed publicly for the first time in academy history. The 7 mysteries lost 3 entries because once enough. Administrative truth is exposed. Ghost stories become filing errors with good publicity. Myra considered that a cultural loss. Noah considered it statistical hygiene. Yuna called it overdue. Adrian said nothing, which usually meant he approved but resented the need to do so aloud. As for me, the promotion arrived in the stupidest way possible. Not crowns, not confessions, not an official title called male lead because thankfully the academy still had some self-respect left. Founder Court Committee. Temporary Student Review Convener for Institutional Transition Hearings. A long, ugly title. Perfect. It meant I chaired sessions, coordinated witness order, and helped redesign the exact flow of student representation the Bureau had twisted for years. It was exhausting, bureaucratic, and so absurdly on theme that Myra threatened to frame the appointment letter under the words promoted. Against his will. I told her it was not against my will. She said that made it funnier. The weirdest part was how natural it felt. Not easy, not flattering, right? Because once I stopped trying to fit Julian back into harmlessness, all the things that had made him such effective infrastructure turned into real leverage. He knew people. He could move between groups. He could make frightened students talk without making them feel staged. He could joke without erasing stakes. He could take the middle of a room and keep it from collapsing into performance. The original story had treated those traits as second lead equipment. The academy had monetized them into social maintenance, but stripped of both those pressures, they were just power. Different powers, still power. That was the whole trick. No one had ever needed Julian to become Adrian. They had just needed Julian never to realize that his own way of holding a room could become center if he stopped giving it away. That realization settled into the school slower than the scandal had, but once it settled, it stayed. Students came to my desk in the new founder committee room with actual problem and no expectation that I would smooth them into nothing first. Younger scholarship boys stopped flinching when prefects asked them for informal adjustments. 2 donor heirs apologized to Yuna in public. Both did it badly, which made it more honest than the polished version probably would have. Leora accepted interim security review command and immediately made everyone hate the efficiency of their own hallways. Noah kept pretending he wasn't part of the central cast while somehow controlling half the building's meaningful paperwork flow from a side desk in the records room. Some habits survive. Narrative revolution. Adrian changed in subtler ways. He stopped arriving at rooms already alone. That was the biggest one. He still wore control like a second uniform, still looked at systems first and feelings second. Still made half the school nervous just by standing too still with a file in his hand, but he Stopped acting like leadership required distance so absolute it erased companionship. He asked for second opinions now, not often, enough. He sat with us at lunch without pretending it was accidental. He laughed more, though only in precise doses, like a man rationing a dangerous luxury. Readers would have called it character growth. I called it finally relaxing one vertebra at a time. And Yuna became impossible to reduce. I think that mattered more than any romance outcome in the end. Once the Bureau lost control, people could not keep making her either symbolic scholarship girl or hidden emotional axis. She was too competent, too angry, too articulate, too visible under her own terms. She led half the testimony redesign work, and then still somehow placed top in Rune construction because, apparently justice work, did not fully interfere with academic violence in her schedule. Students started going to her not for comfort first, but for strategy. Watching that happen was one of the cleanest satisfactions of the whole season. Did the old shape of the triangle disappear? No. That would be dishonest. There were moments, Adrian looking at Yuna over a stack of reports and forgetting to answer a question the first time. Yuna learning how to interrupt him without apology, and him, gradually, finding that intolerable in the exact ratio that made it irresistible. He's standing close enough to both of them, often enough that the old readers in the sky version of the story might still have tried to assign me ache. But the difference now was fundamental. I was not standing there to lose beautifully. I was standing there because this was also my life. And once you understand that, longing becomes one variable among many instead of the cage around all of them. The term ended on a clear day. Not because stories owe anybody symbolic weather, but because sometimes after enough rain the sky gets bored and leaves you alone. The Founder Court looked different by then, not physically. Structurally, students used it now, actually used it, not as a ceremonial passageway, as a place where people expected voice to count. The old banners had been replaced with plain house colors. The projection glass remained mounted because nobody trusted elegant stone not to lie again without a backup. I was carrying 3 folders, a stamp case, and the final revision draft for student placement. Transparency rules when Myra dropped down from the fountain edge and said, "The first years think you're terrifying. Excellent. Also funny. Better. Also there are already threads in the city calling you the accidental male lead of the inquiry." I stopped walking. Myra smiled with all the menace of true friendship. "You hate that phrasing," she said. "I hate everything about that phrasing." "Good, it's sticking." Then she darted off before I could throw paperwork at her. I crossed the court after that thinking about the first day. The bed, the mirror, Adrian's room. Yuna at the notice board, the key, the hidden boxes, the observatory, the banquet, the way. Institutions keep trying to turn people into support beams, because support beams don't ask what the building is for. Then I thought about the room I slept in now, the committee seal in my pocket. The students waiting on the other side of the hall because if I was late, apparently hearings stalled. And nobody wanted to admit how much that mattered. Promotion. It had never meant what the title pretended. Not becoming the one the story was originally lit for. Not replacing the male lead in some neat romantic hierarchy. It meant refusing the assignment of quiet usefulness, refusing to be the soft edge everyone else sharpened themselves against, refusing the whole polite arrangement where some people are allowed to shape events and others are only allowed to carry their emotional luggage. When I finally reached the hearing room door, Adrian was already there with the district clerk, Yuna. Had a stack of annotated witness roots under one arm. Noah was saying something illegal looking too. The archive printer, Leora was reorganizing the security roster by fear tolerance, and the first years near the wall were pretending not to stare. I put the folders on the table, took my seat at the center, and realized something so obvious it almost felt embarrassing. I had spent weeks asking how to become the male lead. The real answer was simpler and much less romantic. You build a room that can't continue without your voice in it, and then you use that voice for something bigger than your own longing. After that, titles become everybody else's problem. The bell rang. I called the hearing to order. And for the first time in either life, the story began where I said it began. Calling the hearing to order should have felt triumphant. It felt administrative. That turned out to be healthier. The first session under the new founder committee was not glamorous enough for the old comic and too consequential for the old academy. 23 students, 9 faculty observers, 2 city clerks. One headmistress who sat through the whole thing without speaking unless procedure bent toward cowardice. The first case involved a scholarship boy from South District whose placement had been downgraded after he refused to tutor a donor heir off record. The second was a music student moved out of principal recital rotation because a visiting patron's niece needed the stage line for future conservatory applications. The third involved committee seat manipulation so petty and so structurally common that half the room started nodding before the student even finished speaking. That was the strange part of building a better room. The old system taught people to treat their own damage like isolated embarrassment. The new one, even in its messy beginning, let pattern become visible enough to share. By the end of the first hearing, 3 students were crying. One master had been forced to admit that tradition was often just unindexed favoritism with candles around it, and I had learned that wielding a gavel over people's pain is a completely different kind of terror than running through a banquet hall with a stolen knife at your back. Myra said that meant I was finally becoming boring in a dignified way. I told her if she ever described me as dignified again, I would ruin her by quoting her own article. Headlines in order. She said that only proved maturity was not contagious. Yuna stayed after the hearing to help sort the follow-up files, which quickly became a habit. At first because there was too much work, then because there was always too much work and we stopped pretending that was the only reason. She was better at calm after the room emptied, during conflict. She was all clean edges and hard attention. Afterward, once it was just ledgers, statements, and late light through the founder court windows, she loosened around the shoulders and got quietly funny in a way the academy still had not fully earned. The first evening it happened, she looked up from a testimony packet, tapped one line with her pencil and said, "Do rich families really write temperament misalignment when they mean my son?" Lost in his whining, I leaned over the file and said, "That is actually one of their kinder phrases." She laughed once, quick and disbelieving, then shook her head. "I used to think the academy was unfair in a random way. It wishes. Now I think it spent years inventing prettier labels for laziness. Also fear. And greed. And fear of greed losing to other greed." She looked at me over the file. "You sound like you were born for committee work." I was born for irritation. The committee just finally found a use for it. That laugh stayed with me longer than it should have. Which was awkward, because there is no clean way to have feelings while also chairing the collapse of an aristocratic influence machine. It makes the whole emotional landscape feel like it was organized by a clerk with a sense of humor. Adrian handled his side of the fallout less visibly and more violently. Not with swords. With lineage. His uncle had tried to hold on through legal channels, family favors, and one pathetic late-night statement about misunderstanding the spirit of student mentorship. That failed the moment Adrian gave testimony in person and refused the family request to limit public detail. I found out because he arrived at the committee room one evening later than usual, dropped a sealed packet on my desk, and said, "My uncle has been formally removed from House Advisory representation." I looked up. "You sound thrilled." "I sound finished." That was different. So I set the packet aside and asked whether he wanted tea, silence, or distraction through procedural violence. He actually considered it. "Tea," he said, "and then procedural violence." I made the tea because apparently this was my life now. Dorm room kettle, committee stamp. Administrative revolution, morally complicated feelings for people with excellent posture. He stood by the window while the water heated and said, without looking at me, he told me the family had spent years shaping my role because institutions require stable centers. He said if I wanted to lead someday, I should thank him for protecting the line from unnecessary sentiment. I leaned against the desk and I told him I had mistaken discipline for integrity for longer than I intended, but I was not going to make that mistake on his behalf as well. The kettle clicked off. I handed him a cup. He took it. For a while neither of us spoke. The committee room windows were open to the late spring air, and Somewhere out near the lower court first years were yelling over some game, as if the school had not recently been disemboweled by its own paperwork. It felt weirdly healthy. Finally I said, you know what I hate most? That the phrase stable center now sounds like a threat. That too, but mostly that everyone in this place keeps taking feelings people genuinely have and converting them into management logic. Affection becomes leverage. Concern becomes supervision. Guidance becomes containment. It's like nobody here was allowed to love another person without building a filing system around it first. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not as witness, not as problem, not as co-conspirator in a school coup. Just looked. That is the most Julian sentence you have ever said, he said quietly. I had no answer ready. That almost never happens to me now. He sipped the tea, too hot because apparently pain remains Central House culture, and added, and also the least. Then he sat down across from me and we did, in fact, commit procedural violence on his Uncle S. Residual correspondence. The Yuna problem reached its own separate peak through Chairwoman Vale. If my father had represented fear turned bureaucratic, Vale represented ambition turned protective. Until protection became ownership, she asked for a second private meeting after the committee. Hearings had turned against the board, this time through Solène formally and with witnesses nearby. Yuna almost refused, then she accepted because, as she put it, I'm tired of having ant-shaped shadows in every room. She asked me to come. Not Adrian. Me. That did something small and unreasonable inside my chest. I ignored it with as much dignity as possible. The meeting happened in the old conservatory with the doors open and one city observer stationed out. In the corridor, Vale arrived in pale green silk and the kind of composure that can make ordinary people confess to mistakes they have not committed. She looked at Yuna first, then at me and said, "This would be easier if you stopped treating every conversation as a tribunal." Yuna sat down opposite her and answered, "This would be easier if you had stopped treating every room as property." I nearly applauded. Vale did not even flinch. She folded her gloves on the table and said she was willing to restructure the Bell Trust in Yuna's favor, separate the scholarship guardianship from the donor advisory chain, and support her future placement publicly if Yuna would agree to limit her comments regarding the family office's historical role in the placement bureau. There it was. Not a bribe exactly. Something older and more poisonous. A final offer to turn your own freedom into a private settlement, so the room that hurt you can preserve face. Yuna looked at her for a very long time. Then she said, "You still think the important thing here is what happens to me?" Vale's expression shifted just enough to count. Yuna continued, "The important thing is that it happened to a lot of people, because women like you kept confusing control with care and respectability with rightness. No shouting. No tears. No melodrama. Just a clean sentence placed exactly where it would hurt." Vale finally turned to me then, maybe because she had decided Julian still looked like the easier variable. "Mercer," she said, "you of all people should understand how unstable institutions become when sentiment overrides structure." I smiled before I answered, because once someone says you of all people, they have already admitted they need the category they assigned you to hold. "No," I said, "I understand what happens when people who built the structure think nobody beneath them gets to rename it." That ended the meeting. Not because Vale had nothing left to say, because she finally understood there was no version of this where she got to frame herself as the tragic adult protecting smaller lives from their own emotion. The old script was dead. She just happened to be standing in the light when it stopped breathing. After she left, Yuna sat very still for a while. I did not fill the silence. Eventually she said, "I used to think if I got good enough, perfect enough, calm enough, the right adults would stop trying to decide me." I leaned back in the chair and said, "And now? Now I think some adults only stop once everybody else can see them trying." That was one of the best summaries of the entire school I ever heard. So I stole it later for committee notes, quietly, with respect. The week after that, Myra made the mistake of telling the first years that I had become moderately heroic. They reacted to this by turning me into a corridor myth. Half the new students started standing straighter when I walked by. The other half developed the kind of whispered curiosity, usually reserved for upperclassmen who either duel well or kiss badly. I did neither in public, which made the rumor spread worse. One second year actually asked if it was true I had fought 3 prefects and a donor proxy in the observatory with only a brass star map and moral conviction. I said no, it was mostly panic. He looked disappointed in a way that genuinely offended me. Myra found that hilarious. She found most things hilarious once the immediate chance of expulsion dropped below 70%. Noah, for his part, finally got dragged into visible relevance whether he wanted it or not. The records room could not run without him anymore, and 3 faculty members had independently figured out that the quiet bellboy from the North Corridor somehow knew more about archive routing than half the administration. He hated this, which naturally made everyone trust him more. One afternoon, I found him standing in front of the projection cabinet with a stack of tagged files looking like a saint of reluctant logistics. He glanced up and said, "I miss anonymity. You miss unilateral access." "That too. Good news, you now have social capital." He looked so appalled, I laughed all the way back to the committee room. That was another thing I had not expected after the scandal, how much easier laughter becomes once it is no longer paying rent for everyone else. By the time the first summer notices went up, the school had stopped treating the founder committee as a temporary disturbance and started treating it as a real governing inconvenience, which, as far as I'm concerned, is what legitimacy feels like in institutions that previously preferred decorative student voices. We got budget review rights. Not much enough. Witness shielding protocol. Messy, valuable. Transparent placement indexing for 1 trial term. Adrian called it insufficient. Yuna called it a beginning. Myra called it the first time the school had ever accidentally become educational. I called it proof that if you drag a story far enough away from the route prepared for it, eventually the ground underneath has to admit you're still standing there. The final weirdness of the term came 2 nights before recess. I was leaving the committee room late, carrying 3 boxes of copied hearing records to the archive transfer desk, because apparently when you become central, you also become your own moving company. Founder Court was almost empty, lanterns low, summer insects throwing themselves fatally at the glass, the kind of in-between our schools pretend not to have even though half their real life hides there. Something was waiting on the center stone. A book. Small dark blue cover, brass clasp, no school seal. I stopped 3 steps away and stared at it, because if a mystery object appears alone in the symbolic center of a recently corrupted academy, there are only 3 possible outcomes and none of them improve your posture. Then I noticed the tag tied to the clasp. My name. Not Julian. Mine. No one in this world should have had that. I set the record boxes down very carefully. The court was silent in a way that did not feel empty. Not haunted exactly. Aware. I picked up the book. The brass clasp opened under my thumb as if it had been waiting for my hand specifically, which is the kind of sentence I am increasingly tired of living. The first page held only 1 line in small, sharp ink. For those who survive the wrong role long enough to rewrite the whole play. I stood in Founder Court with summer air on my face, and the old academy around me finally too changed to pretend it was innocent, and I knew 2 things at once. 1, this term's story was done. 2, the next one had just knocked. I did not open the second page in Founder Court. Growth. Minimal, suspicious growth. Instead, I carried the book back to the committee room, locked the door, closed the shutters, and put it on the center table like it might insult me if left unattended. 5 minutes later, the room contained Adrien, Yuna, Myra, Noah, Leora, and enough accumulated genre trauma to justify it. Exorcist. Myra took 1 look at the cover and said, "That is either the best thing that has happened to us or the exact object that gets everyone cursed before season 2. Optimistic range, I said. It's called versatility. Yuna read the first line twice and went very still. Adrien checked the spine, the clasp, the paper grain, and the lack of academy marking before he touched the page himself. Noah immediately wanted To test the ink against archive stock, Leora wanted to know who had crossed Founder Court without leaving a witness, which honestly was why she remained one of my favorite terrifying people. We opened it together. The book was not a diary. Worse, it was a manual. Not in the sense of step one, confess under moonlight, in the sense of somebody had been studying the Academy's narrative mechanics from inside for a very long time and had written them down in plain language sharp enough to cut skin if spoken in the wrong room. There were sections on centralization events, donor narrative pressure, symbolic promotions, public correction rituals, emotional bait structures, and visibility traps disguised as praise. Half of it read like social theory written by someone who had been repeatedly used by institutions and finally decided to turn pain into methodology. The title on the inner page made Myra sit down harder than her chair deserved. A working guide to becoming the male lead. No author name. No date. Just notes. Dense, angry, precise notes in multiple hands. The first third was old, founder-era references, house dynasties that no longer existed cleanly. Student role maps tied to chapel orders and military pledges. The second third looked newer, maybe a decade old, with donor annotations, board routes, and the first explicit mention of the social placement bureau as a structure, not a rumor. The last section was recent enough to make my neck go cold. References to the forum, to Julian, to the observatory, to me, though not by any name that should have been possible. The current candidate demonstrates the correct instability. Monitor whether self-awareness can be converted into structural refusal rather than decorative suffering. I read that line 3 times before the words became my problem fully. Myra read it over my shoulder and said, very calmly, I hate whoever writes an academia-flavored prophecy. Noah took the book from me with the caution of a man handling both evidence and blasphemy. The hand changes here, he said, flipping 2 pages and pointing with one finger. 3 writers at minimum. Maybe 4. The latest one uses modern procedural shorthand. This part is recent. How recent? Adrian asked. Noah checked the margin notation and answered, after the East Tower file movement, before the donor banquet. The room got colder without whether doing anything, which meant somebody had been close enough to the inquiry to update the guide in real time. Inside the school. Inside the active conflict. Inside, possibly, our own side of the line. That was the kind of twist cheap stories used to keep readers angry. In real life, it mostly makes you tired first. Leora went to the door and checked the hall again. Name the people who handled Founder Court access after the assembly. Too many, I said. Name them anyway. So we did. Maintenance. Projection team. Clerks. 2 prefect runners. 3 committee aides. 1 temporary archive porter. 1 city records assistant. 4 student witnesses with Founder Court routing access. And us. The guide sat open under the committee lamp like it had been waiting years to become everybody's least favorite miracle. Yuna ran her hand lightly over one of the old sections, not touching the ink directly. This means the Bureau wasn't just managing placements, she said. Someone was studying the whole script from inside the machine, trying to understand how the center gets chosen at all. Myra pointed at the page with my line on it. That is not study, that is commentary. She's right, I said. Adrian looked at me. You sound offended. I am offended. I can survive manipulation, but I prefer not to be peer-reviewed by ghosts. That got the exact wrong kind of laugh out of the room, the tired one, the kind people let out when the situation has crossed so far into absurdity that humor becomes the only legal form of vertigo. The obvious answer was to hand the guide directly to Solène. We did. The less obvious answer was what to do after that. Because if the book was real and current and internal, then we were no longer only cleaning up the old machine. We were dealing with someone who understood how to move through the school after reform. Pressure had already forced the main roots into light. Someone working 1 layer ahead of formal exposure. Someone patient enough to document role mechanics instead of simply profiting from them. That made them more dangerous than half the donors. Greed can be mapped. Fascination is worse. Solène read the whole first section before dawn. She sent for us at 6. No tea, no warm chair, no comforting lies about summer recess making the whole thing slower, just the guide laid open on her desk, 2 city seals on the cover, and one sentence the moment we entered. This term is not ending where I hoped. That was the closest she ever came to confession. She had already made 3 decisions. 1. The guide would not enter the public inquiry file yet, not because it was fake, because it was too strange. Strange evidence lets guilty people pretend everything around it is theater. She wanted the donor network buried under boring proof before she gave anyone an excuse to call the whole case a fever dream. 2. Founder court access would now be recorded twice, once officially and once through a route only. She, Leora, and Noah would track. That told me she no longer trusted the Academy's own reforms to hold without pressure, sensible woman. 3. Summer recess was no longer recess. I hated that one on site. The plan, if you can call a headmistress assigning students investigative labor a plan instead of an ethics violation, was simple in theory and guaranteed to become humiliating in practice. The school would publicly move into transition, inquiry, and review. Students would go home or travel as scheduled. The donor network would assume the Academy had entered administrative drag. That was when we would move, not as one obvious team, as dispersed vectors. Adrian through family channels and central house archives. Yuna through scholarship trust records and veil-linked educational charities. Noah through the civic archive copy routes. Myra through alumni gossip and old student paper storage, because apparently every real revolution eventually relies on a woman who can weaponize old newsletters. Leora through prefect and security residual chains. And me. Solène looked directly at me when she said it. Mercer will follow the guide. I stared at her. Absolutely not. Not as disciple, she said, as bait. That was not better. Adrian stepped in before I could become verbally unreasonable in ways that would later embarrass me. You are proposing he move toward a writer who has already demonstrated intimate knowledge of his role position under active risk. Yes. That is reckless. Yes. That is your whole defense. It is my conclusion. I hated how much I respected that. Yuna asked the better question, why him and not one of us? Solène closed the guide and tapped the cover once, because whoever wrote the latest entries is not merely observing the Academy. They are observing Mercer's transition specifically. That means he is either the subject, the threat, or the missing piece they still think they can predict. If we want them to move, he is the pressure point. Myra folded her arms. You make friendship very inconvenient. Better than making it ornamental, Solène replied. Nobody had an answer to that. So summer became a campaign. The school emptied slowly over 3 days. Trunks, farewells, house carriages, students crying on steps for romantic reasons that suddenly felt almost refreshingly simple. Founder court grew quiet. Enough to hear birds again. The committee room lost half its paper noise. The donor banners came down. The inquiry files moved to city lock. On the surface, the Academy looked wounded and resting. Underneath, we were all still moving. On the last evening before departure, I stood in Founder Court again with the guide in my hands and tried to understand the specific shape of my life. Not because I had died and reincarnated into a romance webtoon. That part had somehow become normal. Enough to sit in the background. Because the story had changed once already under pressure, and now it was changing again. The first time, I had fought to stop being side support inside the school. This time, I was about to walk out of the school with a book written for people who survived the wrong role long enough to rewrite the play. That felt less like promotion and more like invitation. Adrian came to say goodbye without calling it goodbye. Of course, he had travel papers under one arm and looked exactly like the kind of heir old houses trust more once they realize he no longer trusts them back. Yuna arrived 10 minutes later with trust records in 3 separate wraps and ink on her wrist again because apparently some things become signature instead of habit. Myra came last, stole the guide out of my hands, read the title one more time and said, if this turns out to be a cult handbook, I want it on record that I object stylishly. Noel from the stair said, you object stylishly to breakfast. Consistency is a virtue. Leora did not come into the court. She watched from the archway and only said, "If anyone dies." Because you start reading alone in abandoned buildings again, I will be offended beyond language. That was from her, approximately a blessing. We did not make promises. That would have cheapened it. We made logistics, where letters would root, which seals to trust, which names to avoid. What emergency phrasing in a note would mean leave now, not tomorrow. Then the bells rang the hour, and the court went briefly gold in the falling light. I looked at all of them and understood something I probably should have realized much sooner. The old version of this story would have made this a separation scene. A pause before romance tightened. A melancholy little page of longing. But that was no longer the shape we had built. This was not a pause. It was expansion. The school had been the first machine. Now we were walking out to find the rest of them. I tucked the guide under my arm, looked once at the founder glass that still reflected the whole. Court back in fragments and said, "All right, let's go find whoever wrote me into the margin." Myra grinned. Yuna shook her head and smiled anyway. Adrian opened the archway. And the story very helpfully refused to end.